All right, this is Tuesday morning, our New Testament World class, and we are about to get started, and Jake's going to start us off with prayer.
Let's pray. Father, we love you. And Lord, we're thankful for the life that we have, and moments like these we get to share with brothers in Christ. Lord, we know that everything that we have, including our life breath, is given to us. Father, we're just so in awe of your goodness and certainly of the mercy that you've bestowed upon us. Father, we pray for this time that we share together, that it will be beneficial for us, but also that it may glorify you in this moment, but also that it may continue to help us glorify you through the remainder of our life. We thank you for Jeremy, his willingness to teach, to inform, to preach as his occupation. And Lord, I ask that you bless him, as well as Mike and Sam and myself. Father, help us to remain faithful unto you and to be strong leaders for our congregations and to represent you the best way that we know how. Father, prepare our hearts and our minds for this study, this class. And again, we know that all great things and all blessings that we have come from you. Father, we give you the glory for this moment, this day. We ask all this in Christ's name. Amen.
All right, so we're looking here this morning at the continuation of the Roman world. And so we're looking at time and distance and travel. And so we do need to understand that time is not as important in ancient culture as it is to modern culture now. Time is viewed now in different ways, right? So certain cultures don't worry about time as much. Where we live in the mountains of North Georgia, they go on what's called mountain time. So you have, especially the folks that kind of grew up there, they're not too worried about getting places on time. You may have heard it called island time in some places. My wife's family is from Puerto Rico. And so when they say, hey, come over for Thanksgiving, we're going to eat at 4 o'clock, what that really means is about 7:30, you might sit down to dinner, right? That's just, they don't focus on time. Whereas other people, especially folks with military background or whatever it might be, you know, if you're supposed to be somewhere at 9 o'clock, if you're there at 8:50, you're late, right? And, you know, you're probably the same way, like, you know. So it just, you know, time is relative in that way, but everything that we do functions on time. Something starts at a time, it ends at a time, you know, and so that's the way we think about it. And not so much in ancient culture, right? It was a little bit different. And talks about this in the first part of chapter 9. It says the modern Western obsession with time began in medieval monasteries where the monks needed some reliable device to awaken them in the middle of the night for prayers. Their search has led us through pocket watches to wrist devices whose makers prefer to call them chronometers. We're seldom out of sight of a timepiece and are virtually enslaved to schedules in school, at work, even in our entertainment. And so, you know, that wasn't part of the ancient world. You know, you had the sun that kind of told you what time it was, but that was about it. And so, just kind of be thinking about that. The reckoning of the day varied from one place to the next too. There's a quote from Pliny the Elder. You remember we said that he was the uncle of Pliny the Younger. It says the actual period of a day has been differently kept by different people. The Babylonians counted the period between 2 sunrises, the Athenians that between 2 sunsets, the Umbrians from midday to midday, the common people everywhere from dawn to dark, the Roman priests and the authorities who fixed the official day, and also the Egyptians, the period from midnight to midnight. So there's different ways, you know, that people started the day. So I think for us, though, we want to know that the Greeks and the Jews counted days from sunset to sunset, right? Sunset to sunset is a day, and the Romans began their day similar to what we do at midnight. So we need to have those two understandings of how time was reckoned. This is for most people and purposes, the day began as sunrise. So for most people and purposes, the day began at sunrise. That's similar to our culture as well. You know, when the sun comes up, that's when the world begins to function. Days were counted in the ancient world as the blank day of month blank. So, the 30th day of the second month or whatever. We see that in the Bible a lot, as well. But the Romans came up with an interesting way of understanding time. So you had the calends, which is the first of the month, the nones, which would be the 5th through the 7th, and the one you're probably familiar with, the Ides. Right? Now, when we say the Ides of March, what day do we mean?
Day Julius Caesar was killed.
Right, absolutely. And what day was that? The 15th, right? Well, the Ides actually could have meant any time, depending on what month it was, from the 13th to the 15th. So you had these different sections of the month that people remember. I'm about to throw this phone across the room if it does not stop buzzing. Goodness gracious. Okay. So I don't want to belabor this point too much, and you can read all about it in this in this section on distance and time and travel. But just sort of keep that in mind. And if you're interested in that, there is a lot of information in the book about the way that they kept up with the months and the days and the years. It's not all that interesting to me. It might be to you. That's okay. You can go read it.
It's a dry read.
Yes, it is. So just kind of be aware of that. So Jews and Greeks did not use formal hours, and there's no Old Testament word for hour except one time in the book of Daniel. The Greeks come up with this idea after the era of Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC, and after he's built this vast empire, he dies as a pretty young man, right? But his kingdom is divided up into 3 sections. Y'all aware of that part of history? Yeah. Right. So and so an hour was originally 1/12 of the total daylight. So
it was 4 sections, right?
Well,
4 generals.
Yeah, but 3 main ones.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
The other one was obsolete.
Right. It did. Yeah, that's right. An hour was originally 1/12 of the total daylight, so it varied in length depending on the season. An hour might not be 60 minutes, it's just 1/12 of the daylight. So it could be, an hour and a half, or it could be less than that, depending on how much daylight was there. John's gospel has a lot of references to hours. It's really the only one that does. And so it talks about it there in those verses in John 1:39, 4:6, 4:52, 19:14.
The hour is come and now is.
Right.
Yeah, his hour had not come. Yeah.
Right, that's right. The book of Acts references hours in Acts 2:15, Acts 3:1, verse 10. The Romans, they spoke of watches that were 3 hours each, the watches of the night. Several different times we see things happening around midnight. Specific time is mentioned in Acts 23:23 when Paul is sent in the 3rd hour of the night. So it's not like the time is completely irrelevant in the New Testament, but you never see, the specificity there. We have examples of hours, but we can be sure the ancients were not focused on precise measurements of time. It just was not part of the culture. The concept of the week was lacking in ancient cultures except for Judaism. Now, why in Judaism is the week so important as opposed to other things?
Keeping the Sabbath.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So the week is important in the Sabbath. And so they would have been one of the cultures that was extremely interested in that. Galatians chapter 4, verse 10 is the verse that's referenced there. You are observing special days and months and seasons and years, right? So you had a calendar that was much less concerned with the functioning of a work week, but you have a calendar that's focused around religious feasts and celebrations and holidays. Astrology dealt with a 7-day cycle, sun, moon, and planets, but it was not part of everyday life outside a Jewish culture. The Roman calendar, and this always cracks me up when I go back and think about it. The Roman calendar contained 150 holidays. Right, 150 holidays. And the work day every day typically ended around noon. So for us, where we work 9 to 5, 300 days a year or whatever it is, The Romans, not so much. They didn't work a whole lot. They didn't work themselves to death, but I guess they got accomplished what they needed to accomplish. Probably started before 9 o'clock too. They probably were up with the sun working, but still, they were a culture, and Mike said it sort of jokingly, they were interested much more in holidays and parties and and their lifestyle rather than they were making a living.
I imagine that depending on where you're at in the Roman Empire, or this might be considered early Roman history, but it got hot pretty quick, and especially in the desert areas.
Well, and you have to think too, most of the people that we're talking about are not slaves, right? They're people that are in the upper echelon of society, and money is not a huge issue.
That's true.
Somebody's working for them, they're not doing the work.
That's right, that's
What
right.
they call work was managing or making sure those tasks were accomplished.
That's right. In ancient times, months were a mess due to differences in a lunar and solar calendar. Priests in each culture kept up with time when months needed to be added sporadically to clear up differences. The Romans, the Greeks, and the Jews all had different names for the month. So you've got the keeping of time back then is just a giant mess. They said, it looks like we need to add a month right here to correct the calendar, right? So this is confusing. Well, we know that in 45 BC, this is corrected with the introduction of the Julian calendar. And this calendar stayed unchanged for 1,500 years, and way more than 1,500 years, as a matter of fact. The Julian calendar became the Gregorian calendar in 1582, which is the calendar that we still use, of course. The names of the months have some interesting origins. I do want to look at that in the book for just a minute. This is on page 262. So the names, first off, let's think about this. So what would be some names of the months that might have ties to the Romans?
August,
Yeah, August after Augustus.
July.
Right, Julius, right? So these names are interesting. It says, they retain the names of the old months. This is the last paragraph. Unless they decided to rename one in someone's honor. Quintilis was renamed July to flatter Julius Caesar. The author says, thankfully, I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy born on the 4th, and Quintilis just doesn't have the same ring to it. That's fine. But then, of course, Augustus had to have Sextilis named after him. Nero tried to rename April in his honor, and Domitian changed September to Germanicus to celebrate some of his triumph over the tribes north of the Danube. Neither change outlived these unpopular emperors, so they were eventually changed back. And so, the names have their meanings as well, but it's kind of crazy. So if you think about September, what is the prefix sept? What number is that usually?
It's usually number one, right?
No, it's usually 7. What about October?
That'd be 8.
Yeah, except that October is what month of the year? Yeah, so everything has sort of gotten moved around over time because of these changes in the calendar. Just be aware of that. Like I said, if you're really interested in that, you can go back and spend a lot more time studying that. Years were an even bigger mess. For example, 225 BC would have been the 21st year of Ptolemy III, the second year of Seleucus III, and the 16th year of Attalus I, because people would reckon time based on how long the king or the ruler had been in power. The modern system that we have, and you'll know that it's been changed in the last little while by our secular friends, instead of BC and AD, which you'll know what those mean, right? BC is what?
Before Christ.
And AD is, well, it's not really after death. That's sort of a popular misconception.
And a Dominican?
Yeah, Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, right? Well, those have been taken out. And so now you have BCE, which is before Common Era, and then CE, which is Common Era. Those things didn't exist until the 6th century, and they didn't become popular until Charlemagne adopts them in the 9th century. Birthdays, not as big of a deal. You reckoned age by what time of life you were in, right? Whether you were a young man or an old man. A young man could be considered anybody under 40. So Jesus, it says in Luke 3:23, was about 30 when he began his ministry. Pliny the Younger, we know he was 17 when Vesuvius erupted. The only reason we know how old he was is because Vesuvius erupted. There was no record-keeping system. People didn't file birth certificates, and that just wasn't part of it. And that's still, true in some cultures today. Distances. Short distances were measured by body parts, the dactyl, the foot, the cubit. When we see the cubit, what is the typical measurement of the cubit?
Isn't it fingers to elbow?
Right, the tip of your fingers to your elbow. It's usually about 18 inches, I believe, but that's how they measure it. Oh, it's a cubit. We still do this, right? If we're going to measure all feet, we just walk the line. That's not an exact measurement, but it's an approximate measurement. Greeks used the stadion, which is 600 feet, while Romans used the millia passus, which is 1,000 steps. So a step was 5 feet, making the Roman mile 300 feet shorter than our mile. Mile markers became an important part of the Roman road system, of course, as you know. The most common measurement for a long distance, and this is used over and over in the Bible, is a day's journey. Man, where's that? It's far. It's a day's journey, right? Well, if I'm going from here to my house, it's about 3 hours. I might say, well, it's a half day's journey. Was it really 12 hours? No, but by the time I do that, half of the day is gone.
That stadia, is that where we get like stadium?
Yes. Travel. Let's talk about travel for just a few minutes. Land travel was always brutal, right? This doesn't really change until the introduction of the railroad in the 1800s. And of course, you know how that impacted the world. I do want to share this quote here. This is on page 272. This would be that quote at the top of the page. It says, it is 17 miles from Rome, so that it is possible, and by the way, this is Pliny talking about a trip to one of his many villas that he had. He said, so that it is possible to spend the night there after necessary business is done without having cut short or hurried the day's work. And it can be approached by more than one route. The roads to Laurentum and Ostia both lead in that direction, but you must leave one at the 14th milestone and the other at the 11th. Whichever way you go, the side road you take is sandy for some distance and rather heavy and slow going if you drive. Wait a minute. If you what? If you drive, but for soft and easily covered on horseback. The view on either side is full of variety, for sometimes the road narrows as it passes through the woods and then it broadens and opens out through the wide meadow. So now, this is interesting to me because, we always think about people when we talk about them traveling in the ancient world as they're walking around in their sandals and it's just this awful, terrible journey. But at least for people with some affluence, travel was pretty common, right? The Roman roads were built. They were pretty safe in most areas. They were, you could travel down them. And here he talks about driving, and Mike's absolutely right. He's talking about carriages, talking about, people being able to ride on horseback, animals. We read in the parable of the Good Samaritan. You remember where the animal plays in there?
Yeah, he had that donkey and then was able to put the dying man on the back of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you often had ways to travel. Sea travel was treacherous. We read about that in Acts 27 with everything going on with Paul. But travel in the time of the Roman Empire was safer than it had ever been before. And in a lot of ways, that quote that we just read from Pliny reminds you of a modern trip. You start at mile marker 17 and be careful if you drive down this road because it's narrow. I mean, I could give those directions to somebody coming to my house. You turn off the main highway and the road's a little bit narrow, so be careful when you drive down it. Now, I don't think that Pliny would have envisioned a Tesla going down these roads, right? But at least for him, travel was a luxury that was kind of safe at the time. And so
we're witnessing some of that right now with North Carolina. Some of their areas they can't get to travel. They have to carry donkeys and mules up there to carry supplies. We think that's chaotic, but that was how it was done.
yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget going and hiking in the Grand Canyon and coming back up out of the canyon, just wanted to die. And these people riding those pack mules, and in my mind thinking, I'm gonna push one of these people off and steal one of these mules. But here was the other thing that may add an insult to injury. If you were over, I think it was 180 pounds, you couldn't ride one of the mules, and so that eliminated me from contention, even as a young man. So but yeah, so just kind of think about those things. When we're thinking about the ancient world, we can't infuse the way that we view time and distance and travel because it was obviously different and it mattered. And one of the things I want to come back to, and we'll do this maybe later in the day today or tomorrow, I do want us to insert, there's a section in there about the birth of Jesus and trying to identify the time when he was born. But I want that to sort of be its own section because it's a very interesting and somewhat convoluted and somewhat controversial discussion. But just if for some reason I forget, remind me of that. All right, questions, comments on some of that?
Because that's the next PowerPoint that I had printed out.
That was the one, I had intended to get to at the end of class yesterday, but it had already been a long day. All right, so now let's jump into what I think will be a lot more interesting to you. That is the powers that be. Oh, I did have that, but we'll come back.
Are you talking about why did Jesus born?
Yeah, the year that Jesus was born. We're going to come back and do that.
That's the first part of.
Yeah, that's right. We'll do that at the beginning after lunch. I want that to sort of be its own section. All right, so let's go back in our history here. Make sure that's coming up on the board. All right, so let's go all the way back, if you want to the year 722 BC. 722 BC. What very important event happens in 722?
722 is when the northern kingdom went away into Syrian captivity.
Yes, the Assyrians come in. Shalmaneser V is sort of the king, but around the time that this final conquest takes place, you have a character named Sargon II, which is his son who actually leads that. And we know about this because we actually have some pieces of information which would have been the things from the palace of Sargon II. So we know a little bit about him from that. But so Sargon II, they conquer the northern tribes. Some of those folks are scattered, of course, throughout the kingdom. The Assyrians are not real great at ruling. They're real good at winning battles, but they're not very stable. And of course, the capital of the Assyrian Empire is what city? Nineveh. Yeah, so a lot of these folks go to Nineveh. And so you have that very famous event. And then in 586 BC, what happens?
That is the third insurrection against Jerusalem, the final.
Yeah.
Right. The first one happened in 606, 605, and then 596, then 686.
So 586 BC, something's 587, and we don't know which exact year. That you will see different things, different places. But Babylon under what king?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, King Nebuchadnezzar. and the general Nebuzaradan. I don't know why they were so obsessed with the letters NEB in Babylon, but they were, right? And so Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and of course, as Mike mentioned, there's 3 different rounds of that. In the first round, we see all the young guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. Nobody has explained to me yet why Daniel's name wasn't changed. The rest of the guys, we know them from their Babylonian name, but Daniel got to keep his Israelite name, because you remember.
Seen Daniel's Babylonian?
Yeah, Belteshazzar. Yeah, so
It's easier, Daniel rolls off the tongue.
it does a little bit. I'll never forget my buddy Michael Whitworth, who came and did a lesson or a series on Daniel for us one time, and he said that he always remembered when he was a kid, Abednego, his name is because of under the bed we go. I don't know why that always cracked me up. And so we have I want you to think about that history, right? So the Babylonians rule, but not for very long, because here we come with the Persian Empire, right? The Persians conquer the Babylonians, and we get the first king, Cyrus the Great. And we have, y'all have seen the cylinder of Cyrus the Great, haven't you?
Yes.
Very important artifact. Whatever. Cyrus the Great cylinder here. So we know that this is written in cuneiform, and this is the translation of it, right? And so we read about Cyrus the Great and their king, their god Marduk. So we read about his conquering of Babylon. And so, it's a pretty important piece of history, because we know the Bible tells us that Cyrus the Great does what as one of his initial decrees?
He's the shepherd that releases Israel back home.
To the homeland.
Right. And so he sends one of my favorite names in the Bible, Zerubbabel, back to lay the foundation of the temple and to start rebuilding the temple. And we get that really poignant moment, to me, one of the most interesting moments in the Bible, in Ezra chapter 3, where they lay the foundation of the temple, and the younger men shout with joy and the older men weep because they remember the glory from 1 Kings 8 of the former temple. Just a really, really poignant moment. And so we have the Persian kings, right? We get to Darius. You'll see some people call him Darius. I always tell people we live in Georgia, so he's Darius. And so we know about these guys. We get to King Xerxes. And who is Xerxes in history, probably? And so you think about our Bible history.
This is when we always get him mixed up with his son.
Yeah.
And so Xerxes, our Xerxes, is the one that allows Xerxes is the one that marries
Esther. Yes.
His son,
Artaxerxes.
Artaxerxes, is the one that releases Nehemiah.
Yes, absolutely. So Darius is important. I don't want to overlook Darius. Darius is mentioned in this narrative as well, but Darius is also mentioned in the book of Daniel. You remember why?
These lines.
Yeah, he's the one that sends Daniel into the lion's den. Xerxes, though, yes, absolutely. Xerxes goes by a different name depending on what version of the Bible you're reading. But he is, and look, there's debate about this. This is not 100% certain, but this is the most common understanding of it. Xerxes is Queen Esther's husband. You remember he deposes Queen Vashti at the beginning, marries Esther. Probably, have y'all ever seen the movie 300? He's probably the king that's portrayed in 300. You remember where they throw the spear? Yeah, throw the spear and it gets maybe it's his nose ring or his earring, and it's draws his blood. I've always thought that was strange. That's Esther's husband that's portrayed in that movie. And then Artaxerxes, you're absolutely right. Nehemiah is the cupbearer, and he's the one that allows Nehemiah to return to rebuild the walls, right? So I always, when I'm teaching this to the congregation or to my middle school kids or high school kids, is you think about it in 3 phrases. Zerubbabel went to rebuild the temple. Ezra came to restore the law, and Nehemiah came to reconstruct the walls, and it helps them sort of remember and put it together. And then you attach it with Cyrus the Great and with, with Darius and with Artaxerxes. And so it kind of helps you put those things together. So you've got the Persians. They've conquered the Babylonians. Remember, all this is prophesied, right, in Daniel chapter 2, and then, that section about the great statue. And so as we go back and we interpret, we know that the Babylonians, are conquered by the Persians. But then the Persians, they run into the buzzsaw of the Greek army. And it's the Battle of Marathon. The Persians and Greeks begin battle there in 490 BC. That movie 300, what battle does that portray?
Battle of Thermopylae.
Thermopylae, right? my favorite. What did
He keeps on saying he's been there. He's gone over there to these places.
Oh, man, it's rubbing it in, right? So one of my favorite sermon illustrations to use, and you guys feel free to use this, is somebody happy walking above us. So the Greek school children, after the Battle of Thermopylae, one of the things they had to do in school was to memorize the name of all 300 men that died at the battle, because without them, the Greeks wouldn't have their freedom. And then if you compare and you contrast it for us, we don't have to remember 300 names. We only have to remember one name, because we're free through Jesus. And so it's a cool little transition. But anyway, so the Persians and the Greeks go to war. We know that the Greeks win. Persia invades Greece in 480 BC under Xerxes, but the advance is slowed by the valiant Spartan resistance of King Leonidas at Thermopylae. Even though the Acropolis is burned, the Greeks win the battle. The fights between Athens and Sparta, which we'll talk about more later, lead to the emergence of Alexander the Great, arguably the most prominent military commander maybe in history. I mean, just went and built an empire. And so
It's such a short amount of time.
right, yeah. So his father is Philip II of Macedon. He was assassinated 2 years later after he became the ruler of Greece. What does his name have to do with the Bible, by the way?
Everything Antioch is named after. It's a Philip of Antioch.
Well, of Macedon.
Macedonia.
I'm thinking about Antioch, the name Antioch.
Antiochus Epiphanes, Macedonia.
Well, Macedonia is already there. He's Philip of Macedon, but city of Philippi is named for him.
Okay.
City of Philippi is named for Philip II, becomes an important city. By the time we get to the Bible, it is a Roman military colony where Roman soldiers retire and go to live. Also, a very, very, very important battle takes place at Philippi after the assassination of Julius Caesar. It is where Octavian and Antony fight Brutus and Cassius and eventually defeat them at the city of Philippi. So this is, helping us ease into Roman history, right? You've got, Alexander the Great coming to power after the death of his father, 336. And so Alexander the Great becomes the leader. And I do want to do this on page, never mind, I don't have that. That's in the Ferguson book. I will try and get that to y'all and upload it, because there's something in the Ferguson book, Backgrounds of Early Christianity. He gives us 10 specific influences of Alexander the Great.
There's a lot. And I think one of the things that we probably underestimate is in the Persian kingdom. When we read that in Esther, the description of how big the Persian kingdom is.
Yeah.
We glance over it. Mm-hmm. But by Alexander the Great conquering that kingdom is what made his superiority so quick, because he when he won those wars, he won half the world at one shot.
Yeah.
So everything else that he had to do afterwards was easier, because he had the might, he had the wealth, he had the experience, and he had the people behind him to do it.
Yeah. And the world, because of him, becomes inherently Greek.
Yeah.
Like the culture. And it's not even necessarily the military part of it, which is important, but the culture. And so after lunch, if y'all will remind me, I think I have this in my bag or in the car somewhere, this Ferguson. I want to look at those influences of Alexander, because he is tremendously important.
Well, we still have things from
Oh, yeah.
that to this day.
Listen, you know, our very form of government as a democracy comes from Greek culture. I mean, there can be no underestimating, and a lot of the New Testament is so influenced by Hellenism, you know, and even in Jesus's upbringing where he lived, very much influenced by that. So just sort of be thinking about those things. Alexander's kingdom after he dies in 323 is divided up into three. You mentioned four, but three significant parts. Really, there's two that are tremendously crucial. One is the Seleucids in Syria, but then the Ptolemies in Egypt become really, really important and sort of become the dominant ones. And on page 58 in your book, it sort of talks about this. It talks about the kingdoms that are broken up. Antigonus rules in Greece and Macedon, Seleucus in Syria, and Ptolemy in Egypt, and also a few smaller territories like Pergamum. And so really they divide up Alexander the Great's kingdom. And so
And their concepts of rule really influenced Hellenism, Christianity, the way that they treated the Jews from two different aspects. Really set a center part of even how we got to the Maccabees, why they did what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Hellenistic age officially ends at about 30 BC, and we begin to see the introduction of the Roman Republic, right? So we've covered, let's see, how many years? We started in 722, and now we're all the way in 30 BC. So we've covered 700 years of history. It's turbulent history, right? But it is the history that shapes, the Old Testament. And so, we're also here in these 400 years of biblical silence, right? We're telling about what happens and how we end up, because the last bit of narrative history, the last bit of the chronological story in the Old Testament, you know what the last book chronologically is? It's Nehemiah. And so we still have Persian rule by the time the Old Testament ends. By the time we get to the New Testament, we're in the age of Augustus Caesar. And so a lot of things happen in that period, right, between Artaxerxes and Octavian that we need to be aware of from secular history. Questions or comments about any of that stuff? I know we've covered a lot of ground right there.
Yeah, that's a couple week class within itself.
Yeah, it is.
We did that in between the testaments.
Yeah.
It's very refreshing, but the book of Daniel helps. Even we have correlation with Isaiah, how Isaiah prophesied of Cyrus being that shepherd. So we have a lot of facts, and then you go back all the way back to Deuteronomy. God promised that because he knew that they were going to announce him, that they would go into the punishment of being in captivity and all those things that would follow. You trace that and you say, wow. So to us, for Christians, it not only proves the sovereignty of God, but it shows that God still worked out through the kingdom of man his plan.
Well, and to your point, you think all the way throughout the Bible how God uses evil to win battles. I think all the way back to the Egyptian period where the Israelites are leaving Egypt, which a lot of skeptics now want to say, oh, there's no evidence that ever happened. But, the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Does that mean that God caused Pharaoh to sin? Of course not. But he used Pharaoh's evil to accomplish something good. I think about the story of Hezekiah and Sennacherib. Sennacherib's this great leader who comes in and, he's going to lay siege, and he does lay siege to Jerusalem. And Hezekiah has to back up the springs to get water into the city, and all these things that happen. And in one night, God sends an angel and wipes out 185,000 people. And then Sennacherib, secular history says, he mysteriously dies. The Bible tells us that he's assassinated by his own sons in the temple while he's worshiping. And so God always uses, right? He uses evil to accomplish his will. And so, something interesting to think about. God saves his own people through Xerxes, through making Esther the queen, right? And That very famous quote that perhaps you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Seeing God's providence, even though his name, of course, is never inherently mentioned in the book of Esther.
Well, and then you add the fact that when you go back and look historically, you look at every great kingdom, there was an influence of God in that kingdom from some shape or form. And I know we don't count Egypt as a great kingdom traditionally, but I count, in my mind, I count Egypt as a great kingdom at a time, because when Joseph went through there, God used Egypt to save the world.
Yeah.
The known world. Even we go in the Persian Empire, Mordecai. Without Mordecai, that kingdom, it starts off in Esther in the beginning of how vast, but it increased under Mordecai because of his influence, and those that were not Jews traditionally wanted to become Jews because of Mordecai and Esther. It's incredible when we really think about that. And you start looking at different ones. You go in the book of Daniel in certain periods of kingdom and time, what he did, his influence. Not to all those kings were all good, but God had someone there to ensure that his people wouldn't completely suffer or be wiped out. You can even go into Ptolemy's and look at how they ruled, how they decided, we'll be smart. We'll come invade you on the Sabbath day. You won't fight.
Mm-hmm.
Come on back with us. I mean, the Sabbath day, same people, but the solutions, what were they doing? We're going to crush you. And that's how it's going to be. You're going to either bend, we'll desecrate the temple. So it's just so much information in between there. And it's a good study, really.
Yeah, you mentioned Egypt. Isn't it interesting how pervasive Egyptian culture still is in the modern world? I remember as a kid being fascinated by Egyptian history. The fact that it's still a country, it's still so prominent, and you go all the way back. And you look really from its biblical origins, in the book of Exodus, and the book of Genesis. I mean, they're there by David Genesis. So, what's that?
Yeah, Abraham went to Egypt
Yeah.
because of a famine.
Did you go there too?
No, well, I wish.
That was good.
All right.
Go to Hezekiah's tomb.
Did you?
Yeah,
That's very cool. Very cool. Did you see the Siloam inscription?
I did.
So all very cool stuff. So, all right. So we've talked about all that history to get us here. So let's talk about this for a minute. Jesus believed in obedience to ruling authority. So let's look at these passages together. Mark chapter 12. Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." By the way, what Caesar is probably in power in Mark chapter 12? I know.
Is it Tiberius?
Yeah, it would have been Tiberius, absolutely. And so Jesus would have been looking at Tiberius's face on that coin. Paul's going to say something similar in Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers have no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. If you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority, then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for the ruler should not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Now, so let's talk about that. Number one, as a Christian, we are supposed to be law-abiding, peace-loving people. We're supposed to do what is right, to live quietly and peacefully in the world. I think that is thematic throughout the Bible. Does that mean that Christians are not supposed to stand up against tyranny and wrongdoing? Of course not. Right? You think about some of the great things that have happened in our world, and Christians have been at the forefront of those movements, right? You think all the way back to in our country, the abolition of slavery. It was Christian ministers who led that. You think back to the civil rights movement. People forget Martin Luther King Jr. was what?
Baptist preacher.
Yes, Baptist preacher, and a pretty good one on top of that, right? We were talking in my middle school class the other day about some of the greatest speeches in the world. We went back and listened to the Gettysburg Address, and we listened to the I Have a Dream speech, just powerful, powerful stuff. So it's been the faith that has led people to change the world. Some of the social justice that we've seen in our society, it's been Christians who are standing up and making a difference. And so does that mean that Christians always agree with everything the government says? Of course not. We have to stand up for what's right. The things that we've seen, the progress that's been made on abortion lately is because Christians have stood up for what's right. And so he's not saying don't stand up for what's right. Paul says we live to please God, not men, right? But he says you don't need to be people who are constantly seeking to make waves. You don't need to be rebels. You don't need to be criminals. You need to submit to the government. You need to pay your taxes, Jesus said. You need to give that honor where it's due. And so we need to be mindful of that. And I think that's especially relevant considering all these people that we're about to talk about, right? Because they're absolutely insane people, but they were in charge of the world, and Jesus says to bend to them. So I guess let's jump up to page 58. 57 says we could speak of a Roman Empire as early as 240 BC. There, the First Punic War, Rome defeats Carthage, they acquire Sicily, but the word empire doesn't usually start until the year 27 BC. And that's when Augustus is given his powers. And by the way, Augustus never wears the title emperor, but he sort of takes that on in 27 BC. Before then, it's sort of just a republic, right? And so the people of the New Testament would not have been overly concerned with the history of Rome. It's not something that was really discussed. Your book says that Livy goes back and writes a lot of that history later from Remus and Romulus and on up throughout the history. But what is important to understand the Bible is who was in charge on a large scale. Does that mean that whoever was the emperor had a great impact on the shaping of the New Testament, the spreading of the gospel? Probably not. But it did very much shape the world and the culture in which this existed. Think about it this way. So when in November, we're going to have an election. You may have heard, right? It'll be a little election. And, you have probably the two most polar opposite political candidates that we've ever had in the history of our country, right? You've got Donald Trump, you've got Kamala Harris, who are just complete opposites. One is an old white man, one is a younger black woman. One is probably the most liberal senator we've ever had. And one, although he used to be a liberal, is probably the most conservative politician our country has ever seen. From everything about them is completely and totally different.
One's a criminal and one's a prosecutor.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, however you want to look at it. Yeah. They're opposites. Yeah. There's just so many things that you could put them as polar opposites, completely and totally different people, right? So one of them will be elected. We're going to have a new president. We know that. And the truth of the matter is, it will not change your life or my life really at all. Other than we'll probably be upset about the result of the election based on who you voted for, except me, I care less. But for a lot of people that are really invested in the election, I got kind of tickled at just riding around Warner Robins the last couple of days. I've seen Harris Walt stickers on cars. Pulled up this morning in the parking lot. I see a Trump sticker on a car. So, people are invested in it. But really, at the end of the day, whoever is sitting in the Oval Office is not that big of a deal, because just for practical purposes, they have to draft or assist in legislation that has to go through 2 houses of Congress. They can't change laws or the Constitution because we have a Supreme Court that's in charge of that. So the figurehead of the president doesn't necessarily have now they do shape policy and they certainly have the powers of veto, but at the end of the day, we've had, I'm trying to think, since I was born in 1986, how many different presidents we've had. And so I guess Reagan would have been president, and then George Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, so Obama, Trump, Biden. So 7 presidents.
Jimmy Carter? Or is he
He
before
was
that?
before, he was in the 70s.
It's 86, bro.
Yeah, so,
I can't remember.
7
I wasn't born
presidents.
then.
He's 93.
Some of us were Christians at 93.
Oh, man.
Who was president when you were born, Mike? What year was it?
I don't know.
King Louis was still
67.
around.
I was born in 67. We can say King Louis.
Lyndon Johnson would have been president in 67.
Lyndon Johnson.
Nixon's elected in 68. So you've seen, 10, 11, maybe a dozen presidents in your life. Have any of them really impacted your day-to-day life at all? I mean, differently? I mean,
I guess the only way they impact it, more importantly, is the influence or the perspective of how we may think about certain things.
right, yeah.
Even like we're talking about today in the class, without the knowledge of God, these conversations become heated, they become violent, they become disrespectful. But our trust is in the Lord. We know who the sovereign King is. And you even reading Romans chapter 13 tells us that God is going to deal with those that have those authority. But at the same time, they do affect our view and our ability maybe to increase our importance to teach the gospel, in the sense that people get scared, people get frustrated, they get uncertain, and it becomes more fruitful for the church. If we look at it now, this is a time where chaos may cause people to look at their lives
Yeah.
and want to come to the Lord.
Yeah, and I think the very first thing you said is important. It's the view, right? So when I go back and I think about United States history, it's defined by who the president is. And that's what I'm trying to get to. I will never probably lay eyes on the president in person. I certainly probably will never meet them. It's not like that Joe Biden is going to wander into our classroom and say, hey guys, how's it going? It doesn't, he's not going to pass legislation that says we can't meet here anymore. And so it has very little effect on our day-to-day lives, but it does affect the culture around us, because if you just walk outside in the empty parking lot and say the name Trump, and you're going to have 10 people who immediately, hey, wait, go outside and say Joe Biden, and you're going, no, I'll never forget I've watched every inauguration, not the whole thing because they're hours long, but because it's important for history. I love history, and I was sitting in my office in January of 21 when Biden was being inaugurated, and we have listen. I hope y'all know this. Georgia, until the late 90s, was a deeply Democratic state. We didn't have a Republican governor in the state of Georgia until 1996, which was Sonny Perdue. And so there are still, even in the mountains, very conservative. I live in probably the most red county in the state of Georgia, which is Gilmer County. There are still some deep roots with the Democrats. There's 2 barbecue restaurants in town that one is where the Republicans would eat, one's where the Democrats would eat, right? So we have members of our church who are still Democrats. We have folks that have moved there from Vermont and New York and Ohio, and people that are still. And so we had a group of ladies that kind of associate politically to the left that came in, and they were like, oh, that's great. You're sitting in your office watching President Biden be inaugurated. And then we had a group of guys that came in later that are a little bit different. They kind of, country guys that are very conservative. Oh, I can't believe that, you're watching that guy that stole the election. And, there's going to be different political vantage points, but I hope you remember this, and this quote rings in my head every year. It doesn't matter who's sitting in the Oval Office, it matters who's sitting on the throne. And that's what matters. In heaven, God reigns on the throne with Jesus at his right hand, and that's what matters. And so, one, I think as preachers, we can't get caught up in it at all. this conversation I'm having with y'all, I probably wouldn't have it with my Bible class, because it is just going to incite rage for whatever reason, and we've got to get beyond that.
I think if you were to look at Israel, particularly when they desired a king, Scripture says, by desiring a king, you're rejecting me as your king, it says essentially through Samuel. And I think if we as a nation, which the reason they wanted a king was for to oppress their oppressors, to gain more land, or not to be in ruin like in the time of the judges. And I think it's the same today. When we think a king or a queen or whoever, president, woman, whoever, can fix all of our problems, then we are putting our focus on something altogether wrong and different.
Absolutely, and you know,
Let me give you another spin on this.
Sure.
The being in the military and you going across overseas, you'll appreciate this and you'll understand how we are viewed as a nation or as a people is very important in a sense of we represent democracy, we represent an opportunity. That's why a lot of people want to come to the country, to vote or the fact to have a say. And that's why the biggest thing you can get upset with people is that the ones who don't vote at all. You vote because you don't realize by not voting, you have voted. You really don't care. But if you go into other countries and you are proclaimed as American, you live as American, then you know what happens? Your cultural status now becomes like a focal point. They address you differently. And if you're white, they treat you one way. If you're black, they treat you another way. And this is within the military.
Yeah.
You can see it. And so it's very, we have to be careful. When I came and I was part of the South Carolina, when I came, me being up north, a Yankee, right? I didn't have an attitude where I was so arrogant towards people. I treated the common people, which they in South Carolina were called geechies. And so when they had their language, they say, up the window, right? And that just means roll up the window.
Yeah.
But you have some people in the military because they came and their dialect and they understood how to speak and all that, they would laugh and mock that. Then they would go to their clubs and wonder why they were getting retaliation on themselves because they didn't respect them. And it didn't matter what, so I see I have a different viewpoint in how what we represent and who we are is important, but at the same time, we cannot lose our sensibility and our common identity. And us being Christians, this is where I go back to, we're more concerned with the cultures of the world instead of what the culture should be in the church.
And let me pitch this to you, Mike. You may have an interesting perspective on this. Obviously, the Scripture says our citizenship is in heaven for the Christian. And quite frankly, I'm proud to be an American, but I don't care. If I was born in a different country, that's fine too. And Mike, what I want to ask you is, because it doesn't really grind my gears or anything, but people say, Lord, protect our country. Like, man, there's hundreds of other countries too, with souls in those countries. And man, if I was born in that country, I'd hope somebody would pray for me too. Now, obviously, I am proud to be an American and the freedom and opportunity we have here. And I want us to be safe. I want us to have a sound, firm defense. I know my citizenship is in heaven. And honestly, like you said, if we hold our allegiance to the world, man, it'll show.
I had one time an elder in our congregation he's aged out now. He's had to step away because of health problems, but very important elder and a guy that I love. Like he was my own grandfather, just a great man. But it was around July 4th, one Wednesday night. He said, "Hey, before Bible class, how about getting up there and leading God Bless America or let's sing the national anthem or something?" And I said, "Absolutely not." "What are you talking about?" I said, "We're here to worship God. We're not worshiping our country. What are you talking about?" He was like, "Well, God and country are closely aligned, and I just don't agree with that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be patriotic. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be proud of our country, like you mentioned. I think we need to be involved civically and vote, take care of our responsibilities. I sort of laughed at a bunch of people during the last election saying, "Oh, well, I'm not going to vote in Georgia because we already know which way that Georgia's going to go." And now it is a swing state, completely turned around, went blue last time, which is crazy. But just that stuff is so secondary to what really matters. And if I get up and I associate my pride in my country with my worship to God, I've got my priorities mixed up. And we have a lot of brethren who conflate those two things. And they get so wrapped up, and it's almost like we worship country alongside God. And we cannot ever, ever, ever fall into that trap. And I know that, it's something that's common. And listen, I've been around patriotism my whole life. I have, family members who have served in the military who wear the colors of this country like a badge of honor. My father-in-law has military tattoos all over his body where he was a soldier and were the things that he went through. And I'm not discrediting any of that. What I am saying is that it is a distant second in our list of priorities to serving and worshiping God. Because if the United States ceased to exist tomorrow, the kingdom of heaven would still exist.
And that's right. I think when I was down with Sam this past week, one of the comments I made is that when you go over to the holy man, the old historical lands and like that, they have found in some of the ruins and places the old church, and you would have one side, you would have scriptures written down in Jewish language and letters. And on the other side, it had written in Gentile letters. So they worship Jew and Gentile together in one congregation. But the church had to be able to understand how to come as society through the word of God. And that's still our challenge today. Our challenge is just like our reading this class. If we don't learn certain customs, even when we talk about slavery, the slavery that happened, or what we're talking about in this time, is completely different from what happened in this country. But when you mention the word slavery or you say certain things with connotation, it brings or invokes a certain, but you have to help people with understanding. That First Peter letter, he deals with 4 platforms of submission: civil authority, to the workplace, to Jesus, and to one another relationship. But that's probably one of those passages in the scriptures that has been so misused, so mistreated and manipulated to dictate to people. God was not approving slavery, but Christianity would stamp out slavery as it went down the road. And so we have to see things for what they are and try to help people.
And we have to, Jake mentioned the culture. We have to, as the preachers, set the tone culturally in our church. For instance, I'll just tell you this, during the last election, I delivered a lesson that it was very, and there's no other, it was very stern, because we had some members who were humiliating and embarrassing themselves and each other on social media with things they were posting. And so we did a lesson about influence and about how we influence people and governing our social media usage. I mean, I was downright ugly in some of the part, not in a hateful way, but in a reminder of, you are embarrassing yourself and you're embarrassing your family, you're embarrassing the church.
Yeah, just because you have the right to do it doesn't mean God's giving you the right to do it.
And so
I've had people come to our congregation and ask the question, is this a black congregation or a white congregation?
Yeah.
And in the midst of the congregation as we're leaving, or we're sitting, and my reply is, we're a sound congregation. Now, there is a color line, but the Bible does not teach us to observe the line. It teaches us to observe Christ. Now, you choose what you want to be. Now, but that's the mixed bag you got coming into the congregation these days. You know what I'm saying?
Well, you face different battles based on where you are. So where I preached before in Phoenix City, where Jake is, and specifically the congregation I was at, was a very predominantly white area at one time. Now it is a predominantly black area as it relates to people that live there. So when I got there, we had older members who've been going there, since Moses parted the Red Sea, and then we had younger families that had just moved in the area, in addition to soldiers. So when I would get up on Sunday, we would have white members and black members, Hispanic members, Filipino members, and so we faced some of those issues head on. I remember when I was very young as a preacher, probably 23, 24, was when the Confederate flag stuff was going on. And on a Wednesday night, I'd been seeing stuff on social media, and I said, all right, we're going to talk about it. Let's talk about it. So we had people that, wanted to keep the Confederate flag for whatever reason, and they explained their point of view. And we had some members who obviously it brought back images of slavery and of a time when our country was divided, and they brought out their point of view. And we talked about it civilly and lovingly. And I shared my point of view, which was that, everybody has a right to be proud of their cultural heritage, but we draw the line when we offend other people. And if you do something that is knowingly offensive, you are in sin. And so, we had that great discussion. And I remember we had a family that was visiting. The dad was Hispanic and the mom was black. And that following Sunday, they placed membership. And she said that discussion helped us realize that this is where we needed to be. And as a matter of fact, I think those people still stream my sermons in LJ every Sunday just because that impacted them in such a way. I remember the Sunday after Ferguson, Missouri. I got up with tears. I remember staying up all night watching that. I mean, watching reporters having to duck from flying bullets. It was just horrific. I don't know if y'all even remember that. Just horrible. And that was sort of the beginning of this rioting and this big discussion about police brutality. And what we fail to realize is that each case is individual and has to be looked at from its own individual circumstances rather than just painting them with a broad brush. But we spent that whole Sunday talking about how Christians ought to react when they see things like that. I mean, everybody in the building had tears in their eyes because we have to set the tone culturally in that we're not afraid to talk about these things, but we have to talk about them in a way that Christ would approach them. And so I got a text last night. One of the things that's been on my mind all night is, I avoid talking about politics from the pulpit, not because I'm afraid of it, but because I know it will do more harm than good, especially right now when things are already so tense. But there comes a point where, because of the way that Christians are behaving, that you have to address things. And he said, I think we ought to be talking about politics all the time from the pulpit, not necessarily political candidates or positions, but what's right and wrong. He said, we have to be talking about abortion. We have to be talking about these things. I remember in an adult Bible class. So where I live now is a predominantly white area, but what we also have is a ton of illegal immigrants that come from Guatemala because our number one crop is apples. And so you will not find a lot of white people in North Georgia that are willing to work in apple orchards because they think it's beneath them. And so we have people that come over and they're from Guatemala and they sit and they pick the apples and they work in the orchards, or they work in the carpet mills, or they work in the tire factories. And so we have a large group of Hispanic children that are bused to church every Sunday. We have a few families and they are all illegal. The children are not because they've been born here, but the parents are illegal. And so we were sitting in a Bible class. We talked about immigration one Sunday. And the immediate response was, it's against the law, it's a sin, send them back where they came. And I said, okay, let's talk about that. These little kids that you hug every Sunday and that we're teaching the Bible, and some of which have been baptized and are now part of our church, do you want them to be orphans? What do you mean? I said, if we send their parents back who are here illegally, they will be orphaned. They'll end up in foster care. Do you want that for this little child that I just saw you hugging in the hallway before church started? Well, of course not. I said, okay, well, then you need to rethink your position on this because it affects real people more than just being, okay, well, I want to stand by the rule of law. And so what we have to do, guys, is set the culture and set the sense of compassion in our members and make sure that they behave according to the way that Christ would behave. And when we do that, number one, it's not always going to be popular, but it will hopefully help people see the way they ought to behave. It's a tough thing. I remember when Trump, it was all still a joke at this time. I think this was 2015, maybe, the fact that he was going to run for president, it was a big publicity stunt. I still believe that it was originally, but and he was doing an interview, and they asked him what his favorite book of the Bible was. Do y'all remember this?
Yeah, 2 Corinthians.
2 Corinthians, right? And so I showed that clip on a Wednesday night devotional, not for anything political, but to show, and the whole lesson was about biblical illiteracy in our society and how we have to be teaching the word so that people will know it. Well, little did I know, we had a family who were grassroots Trump supporters. And man, they got so mad, and they went to the elders and they wrote a scathing letter and all that. And I apologized to them. I had no idea their allegiance to him, and whatever it might have been. And I explained to them my point of view, and we ended up becoming great friends. They moved to Texas. They came back, and every time that I see them, we just hug each other and we get along great. But listen, you're going to rub people the wrong way. And I would not recommend talking about politics a lot from the pulpit, but sometimes the issues get so heated and so divisive that we have to stand up and say something. And so we have to determine when that is. All right. Questions, comments? Now, I told you I like to chase rabbits. There we go.
It reminds me of what one of our teachers Glasgow says about preaching. He says, I welcome friendship, but I'm not up there to make friends.
Yeah.
I'm up there to teach truth.
Well, you can probably tell that he was one of my mentors when I was a young preacher. We talk a lot. I actually preached at Casita Road the first day in September. Yeah, we're big buddies. Yeah, let me tell you what he did to me. So we had this television show, Know Your Bible. I became a preacher at 23, and he asked me, hey, would you want to be on our TV show? Man, I'd love to. That'd be awesome. He said, all right, I'm going to send you the questions. So my very first question that I had to answer on TV with cameras in my face at 23 was, please explain the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So I still pick on him about that.
That's
Yes, and so he obviously was satisfied with my answer, and so we've been buddies ever since then. So yeah, you're right. You want to be friendly with the church, but you're not there to make friends. Sometimes you're going to say things that are offensive, but if they are offensive in the way that God would have them be offensive, then that's okay. What we can never, ever, ever, ever do, is take political sides from the pulpit. If you ever get up, if your congregation is majority black and you say, hey, we ought to vote for Kamala Harris. If your congregation is majority white and you say we ought to be voting for Donald Trump, you have just right then, I believe you've committed sin, because you have caused division in your church unnecessarily.
Divisive for the sake of being divisive.
Yeah.
God's word is already a sword. It's going to be divisive. And just get out, and it doesn't have to be just politics. You can get up and just be like, well, I know people struggle with this or that, and I'm going to just hammer them.
Yeah. I used to joke about this, but now I'm actually really careful with it. I used to get up during football season and make jokes all the time about, oh yeah, it's tough. Alabama lost to Vanderbilt Sunday. Get up in the pulpit and joke about it. People are genuinely offended by that stuff. If you know Alabama fans, you know how seriously they take that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have to be careful and you brought it's a great way to phrase it. Don't be divisive for the reason of being divisive. There's going to be times where you have to be, but don't be just to do it. And, I have a friend, and I love him. I mean, I think he's a great man, but he posted on his church's Facebook page, this is about 2 or 3 years ago, come worship with us on Sunday. We're going to talk about why you can't be a Christian and a Democrat at the same time.
How would he see?
He just ruined his influence as a preacher in that very moment.
Well, we have a sword. God's word is a sword. You don't got to use it. You can show it, but you don't have to cut people every time with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't use God's word, but what I'm saying is you can show the sword.
Yeah.
But there's times where you do have to use it. It's like war. You do have to use it.
But see, I think God's word is a sword, but I don't think it's ever meant to wound, right?
It's used for protection.
It's used for protection, and it's used, so you think about things that are sharp. Right? I always carry a knife with me. I don't have it right now because I've taken it out of my bag because I teach school and you can't take a big knife into a school building anymore because of the things that have gone on. But I almost always have a knife. Well, that knife has many purposes. I have lots of knives, but the one I carry most of the time is it's an automatic knife. It's a Benchmade. You push the button and the blade comes flying out of that thing, and you can really do some damage with it. I mean, it is razor sharp. It is a weapon. It is meant to be a weapon. I can stab somebody with it. I can slice somebody with it. I mean, I can do a lot of damage with that knife. I could also save somebody's life with that knife. If someone had something stuck in them and I heated that thing up to where it was sterile, I could remove whatever the obstruction was. And you could perform surgery with that knife if you were skilled enough, right? Out in the field. When you're in the military, you probably learned, field medic stuff. I can use that knife as a tool, right? I can pry stuff open with it. I can dig stuff out of the ground. I can cut things. You can, if you needed to, you could saw kindling to build a fire with that knife. I mean, you could do all sorts of stuff with that knife. It's a tool. But the only thing you can do with that knife that is a crime is intentionally wound somebody with it, right? That's the only thing you can do with that thing that is considered a crime. The same thing is true with God's word. I can use it for all these different purposes. For protection, absolutely, it protects us. I can use it to influence. I can use it, you mentioned this yesterday, to pierce the heart. But if I ever use it intentionally as a weapon to wound, then I'm sinning. And
there are a lot of Christians that get frustrated, aggravated, and they do that. And they destroy congregations. They leave wounds that are sometimes unhealable because the person will never come to the Lord because they have taken that
vision.
Yeah, they've taken the hope out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that's the only reason I'm saying it's unhealable, because they don't even want to hear. Let me just close the word of God. I don't want to, because I know what that preacher said, and so there's no chance for them to really allow them unless somebody else comes in their life and they demonstrate the word of God to them. You remember on the subject now, but the powers that be, when people are having problems with bringing guns into the assembly. When we were going through the mass shootings in the churches, now it's starting to become, before the pandemic, mass shootings were a common thing, unfortunately, we're getting used to. And it was starting to bleed into the Lord's church. And so many congregations were having meetings and trying to figure out, how do we do this without usurping authority, without violating somebody else's rights, but also keeping the worship and the sanctuary safe. And one of the things that we started learning to do was, we got together, we did it up here, we got together and we started making sure let's identify first responders in your congregation. Let's identify, if you need some training, if something does happen, how you can help save somebody's life. Let's not look at it just as me, because it's still hard. It's real. Somebody comes into your congregation and they start just assaulting people. It got to a point, and unfortunately, it's split some congregations because, some say, hey, we have the right to bear arms. Well, you have the right to bear arms, but you have to bear arms and bring them into the worship center. That's right. You may have to have somebody hired outside the assembly to protect the assembly. But I mean, there's all kind of stuff that happens. And that came from a concept like this, the powers that be.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And there's all those different, discussions that the churches have to have. But we are responsible, for setting the tone and balancing that, and kind of coming back circular to where we're going with this. Jesus believed, Paul taught as well, that we are to be subject to governing authorities, but we also are to stand up for the truth. And when those things come in conflict with each other, we have to stand up for the truth in the way that Jesus would have.
Like Daniel helped out, Babylon helped out every nation that he was allowed to be a part of, but he certainly stood up for what God said first.
I've heard people make this criticism that we can't be silent anymore. I always point them to this. What did Jesus say when he was standing before Pilate?
Nothing.
What did he do when those people wanted to murder the woman in John chapter 8? that never said a word. Through his conduct and through his silence, he spoke volumes. So there are times when we just have to be silent too. And so we have to distinguish when those things are. All right.
Let me just take a quick story.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Just laugh. And this is not funny, but the government gave an evacuation order in Lake Charles area a couple years ago. And church members ignored the evacuation order for a hurricane coming through. Their solace was to run to the church building and be in the building and that the Lord would protect them. This is real live events in the last couple of years. The Lord allowed through providence, they were saved. But the roof came off, the walls were shaking. They were trusting in the building instead of understanding what the word. And you would say, well, how can the people of God have a fault like that? Because they come into the worship service, empty in and empty out, never understanding what the word of God means. God gave us common sense, but I'm going to stay under the building and say, he's my refuge. And now they're faithful, so now they get an evacuation order. Oh, no, we're going around.
That's right. Lesson learned. Right?
Yeah, whole family. I'm like, wow, man. My brother told me that. I fell out.
All right, well, let's power through, and then in just a little bit, we'll go ahead and take a lunch break, but I want to kind of get through a little bit more of this. So back to the Roman Empire. So the empire technically begins 27 BC, but the first emperor followed a series of civil wars. You've heard about these in the 80s BC, and then, of course, the very famous one in the 50s BC between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Julius Caesar, of course, comes to the throne after that. If you would even use the word throne, comes to power. And then, of course, Octavian and Mark Antony in the 30s. So Julius Caesar did not always rule by himself. You are aware of the first triumvirate, which was Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And so that did not end well. It failed. And so Julius Caesar is assassinated in 44 BC by Brutus and Cassius. Well-known, of course, historical event, and as Samuel mentioned to us yesterday, well-known in literature as well because of how much it was written about. But Julius Caesar is a hugely important figure in Roman history, in world history. If you think about how many things surrounding Julius Caesar are just normal parts of the English language, right? So we're talking about idioms. What does it mean to cross the Rubicon? Cross the Rubicon.
I don't know, but I've heard it 1,000 times.
Yeah, it's you've reached the point of no return.
Yeah.
You've crossed the Rubicon. Well, that comes from Julius Caesar, right? And his crossing of the river. The phrase "to be stabbed in the back."
Yeah.
Julius Caesar,
The
right?
die is cast.
To die is cast, right? Beware the Ides of March. And so all of these things come from the life of Julius Caesar. So he's tremendously important culturally, but. He names a successor, his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, as the heir. He also, in his will, he adopts him. He doesn't adopt him, but in his will, he adopts him, and he becomes his son. And as you did then, you adopt the name Julius Caesar Octavius. And he is referred to historically as Octavian until 27 BC. Octavian is in charge. He forms a second triumvirate. I guess he didn't learn from the first one. And so he controls the Latin-speaking western half of the empire. He controls the Latin-speaking western half of the empire. Then Mark Antony, not the singer that was married to Jennifer Lopez, it's a different guy. He controls the Greek-speaking eastern part of the empire. And Lepidus, who's the third member of the triumvirate, he doesn't get any land, but he is named high priest. And so they come together after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony and Octavian and Lepidus, they go to battle and they defeat Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Very, very, very important battle. All right, now let's get messy for a second. So Mark Antony is urged on by his mistress, Cleopatra, who, by the way, just happened to also be sleeping with Julius Caesar. She slept with Caesar, then aligned herself with Mark Antony. History does not record her as an excessively attractive woman, but she had to be an influential woman because she's the queen of Egypt and she's the mistress of Caesar and Antony. So she pushes Antony to go to war with Octavian. Octavian cannot declare war on Mark Antony because he's a Roman, so he declares war on Egypt and Cleopatra. And at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, they defeat her, and Antony, to consolidate power. And so this is a turbulent time in history. You're talking about 50 years of civil war, from the first civil war in the 80s between then between Julius Caesar and Pompey, and then between Octavian and Mark Antony, and then Julius Caesar being assassinated. There's all of this instability, right? And you almost think, well, this is never even going to develop into an empire. This thing is going to crumble. But it's Octavian that brings stability, right? But before that, this is an important note. If you're writing down on your notes or keeping things, it's actually Mark Antony who helps capture Jerusalem. And it's Antony who inserts Herod as a client king in 37 BC. But Herod is smart, right? He is able to flip his loyalty to Octavian after Octavian wins the battle. So he is an ally to Mark Antony, but he's able to flip that allegiance pretty quickly. There's a little bit of
That'll be Herod the Great, right?
yes, and there's a little bit written about it in your book on page 60. This is on page 60. It says, Herod did some fancy footwork to shift his allegiance to Octavian. Josephus records a speech in which Herod lays most of the blame for the situation on Cleopatra and promises that he will be as loyal to Octavian as he was to Antony. So Herod the Great, right? Remember they're descendant from the Edomites, and there's actually going to be a section about this later on when we get to the leaders of Judea. But so he flips his loyalty. Herod's father, interestingly, had also supported Brutus and Cassius. So somehow Herod, he had to be a very, very shrewd politician, because he was always on the wrong side of the battles, yet he somehow remained in power until 4 BC. And so he's client king for 33 years. And of course, we know from the biblical account about his life. So 27 BC, Octavian becomes Augustus. He's given the power of proconsul, which is control of the army. In 23 BC, he's given the powers of tribune and the power to veto any action of any other magistrate. He was never called emperor. That's important to note. He was never called emperor, but he took the titles of leading citizen, of imperator, which is general, and took the religious titles as well. Anybody know who would later on take that title, Pontifex Maximus? Who would take that title later? It wouldn't be the emperor anymore. Look at the first part, pontiff.
Pilate?
Nope. The bishop of Rome would take that title.
I kept on thinking
Pontifex Maximus. That would be the Pope's title later on. It would no longer belong to the general. They separated that. But so I mean, he has control of the army. He's the leading citizen. He's the controlling general. He's in charge of religious practices. So he is, and for all intents and purposes, the emperor, although he never takes that title, because he, in all of his ruling, he rules for a long time. He convinces the people that they are still in a republic. He convinces them, right, that they are still in charge, and that they're still, the Senate is ruling and the army is ruling, and that he's just there to sort of guide the process. But what really he's done is consolidated the power completely and totally. And so Augustus brings on the Pax Romana, a time of peace, and he is tremendously significant to world history and to Roman history. But he does have a little bit of a problem. Since he is not a king, he cannot name a successor. But he knows, look, we're in the middle of all this time of civil war. We have to figure out how to do this. And so he wants to find a successor, but he only has a daughter. Her name is Julia. His second wife has 2 sons, but he doesn't want to name them successor. So he marries off his daughter to a number of different people. The first one is his nephew Marcellus, then to his commander-in-chief Agrippa, and then finally he names as his successor his stepson Tiberius. And so Marcellus dies in 22. There's really nobody else to take over except for Tiberius. And so the marriage of Augustus's granddaughter Agrippina to Germanicus blends the 2 families, and we call this the Judeo-Claudian dynasty. And there is an appendix in the back of your book, Appendix 2, that lays out. I don't know, can you see that? Yeah, that's pretty good. It lays out all the different people, right? So you see Julius Caesar, and the line of ascension to Octavius, and so you get all of these different characters and who they belong to and where they come from, and we see the emperors, of course, in capital letters: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And this is what's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Julio-Claudian emperors. And so you can do with that what you will, and it sort of gives you the line. There's lots of marriages, there's lots of killing, there's lots of assassinations, there's lots of stuff going on, but it helps you to see. And there is a lot of incest. I mean, there's just no other way to put it, right? Yes, right.
I have a question for sake of clarification.
Sure.
Gaius or Gaius Octavius. So his name was changed to Julius Caesar Octavianus.
Yes.
So instead of Octavius, Octavianus. But then he's given an honorary title of Augustus.
Yeah, Augustus Caesar.
And so he's known as Octavian, as Gaius, as.
Yeah, he's known for all intents and purposes as Octavian until 27 BC, and then he's given the title Augustus.
Okay. So on the chart, one has Octavius.
Augustus Caesar.
Augustus is the same as Octavius there?
Yes.
Okay. And then what's the other end of that? That's, if Augustus is on the left, what's on the right? It says Octaria?
So that's Mark Antony. And so
Oh, okay.
showing how, because he has part of this family lineage as well.
Okay, gotcha.
Because they were all of the Caesarian people when the first Civil War broke out. Mark was a part of the Caesarians, and
Yes.
then Brutus and them were part of the Pompeians.
Yes. And so it's all one big happy family. And
Yeah,
we
real
said-
happy.
Right. Remember we said that Augustus is marrying off his daughter to try to establish an heir? Well, there's her first marriage to Marcellus, her marriage to Agrippa, and so it sort of shows where everybody comes from. And this is her first marriage to Hispania, and this is where we get Tiberius. So Tiberius is Augustus's stepson. So it's trying to put all that together. Good luck. And this is just the first part, right? So we get later to the Flavian dynasty and we get more of this stuff. So just be aware of all that stuff. It's important. So Caesar Augustus, right, is brings on the Roman peace, stabilizes the empire. He's the first emperor, even though he doesn't wear the title. And so he dies in AD 14. He's replaced by his son, who he does adopt, Tiberius. And we mentioned that in Mark 12, it's Tiberius's face on the coin. He was different from Augustus in every way. So Augustus would walk down the street in Rome and just be hailed and didn't have really security. He was beloved. I mean, people just adored him. Tiberius, for the last 10 years of his reign, doesn't even live in Rome. He's not seen by people. He's secluded. He doesn't come to Rome at all. He prefers to let other people do the ruling, and he just kind of wears the title. But he has a potential successor, Germanicus, but he's murdered, and that leaves his son Gaius to rule. He was known by his nickname, Botus Pequeñus, Little Boots, which is Caligula. And so Tiberius knows that Caligula is a lunatic. He can already tell. He famously says that he is nursing a viper in the bosom of Rome. And so sort of his last act is to leave him in charge. His son dies, but he has a nephew, by the way, named Claudius, and it mentions here on page 62, if you want to highlight this. This is at the bottom. Tiberius had little choice of a successor. His own son died in AD 23. His nephew Claudius had a nervous facial tic, stuttered, lipped, and in general was considered unfit to rule. Another nephew, Germanicus, who we mentioned here, the husband of Augustus's granddaughter, Agrippina the elder. So let's go back here, right? Germanicus is here. And by the way, Germanicus was adored by the people. He was a great leader. He would have been a great emperor. But he was starting to get too popular, so Tiberius says, I don't think so. He has him murdered. Most of Germanicus' children also were executed or exiled. And so that only leaves Germanicus' son, Gaius, right? Now let's go back. So Germanicus here, Tiberius says, no, he's too popular. So instead, this guy, Germanicus' son, who's named Gaius, who becomes Caligula by his nickname, we leave him in charge. Suetonius says that Tiberius chose his grandnephew Caligula because he wanted the Romans to look back on his own reign as a golden age, and he suspected what sort of ruler Caligula would become. So he knows that Caligula is going to be a crazy person. He says he is nursing a viper in the bosom of Rome. What's that?
I say cuckoo for cuckoo.
That's right. So Caligula, he is indeed a monster. In his teen years, he committed incest with all three of his sisters and then commemorated his sisters with coins. In mythology, you know that Zeus marries his sister, who is, oh my goodness.
Hera.
Yes, Hera, thank you. He marries Hera, and so since Caligula thinks that he is Zeus, he marries one of his own sisters as well. Tiberius was notoriously thrifty, and he, for 20 years, had saved up a whole bunch of money. In the first year of Caligula's reign, he spent every bit of the treasury of Rome. And so to recoup that, he began this process where he would arrest wealthy people in order to secure their finances. He would come up with some sort of crime, he would arrest them and steal their money to replace all the money that he had spent. He named his favorite racehorse as a member of the Senate and was about to promote him again to be a leader of the military. And the Praetorians murdered him. He was killed by his own soldiers.
Horse?
Yeah, I don't know if the horse was in on it or
No,
not.
that would have been hilarious to see though in a tent meeting. Here's all these centurions, and there's just one horse, and they're like, all right, what do we do?
That's pretty good. So Caligula is killed. So while all this is going on, Caligula is most of the people that were in charge in Rome had a respect for the Jews. And one of the things that they respected was that the Jews would not worship images. Well, Caligula lacked that respect. And so as Caligula was being murdered, one of his leaders was on the way to Jerusalem to put a statue of Caligula in the temple. And the only reason that didn't happen is because he was murdered. One guy had already refused to do it, and he had taken him out from power and appointed somebody else so that so that this would happen. So the only thing that prevented that atrocity was his death. And once again, he was murdered by.
Well, imagine the riots that would have happened if he
Oh, yeah.
did that.
I feel like Rome would have got away with it because of their army, but
Mhm.
still Jews would have.
Would have caused a big problem.
Yeah.
Well, it would have brought on the war earlier, probably. So,
Christians would be like, I want out of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you have all of this going on, right? You have, Tiberius and Augustus, who had sort of been peacekeepers, even though Tiberius wasn't around. Caligula destroys it all. And so they've got to find somebody that's not crazy to rule the empire, right? So the Praetorians, they think, all right, we've had these guys in charge, for the last 70 plus years, and they've ruled. Let's find somebody that we can install as a puppet leader where we can be in charge. And so after the death of Caligula, they go and they find hiding behind a drapery in the palace, Caligula's uncle. Let's go back. So you see here we have Caligula and we have Claudius, right? So Claudius is, if we go back up to, okay, you can put all the pieces together, trying to think where Claudius fits into all this. I think that Claudius, let's go back. Claudius is a nephew of Tiberius, and so he is actually the uncle of Caligula. So he is an older man than Caligula, but for his whole life, he has, let's go back here. But for his whole life, people have thought that he was mentally deficient. He had a facial tic, he stuttered, he limped, and so he was somebody that people viewed as incompetent. But there's a letter from Augustus to his wife where Augustus says, sometimes, now you've got to think, this is Augustus who's already seeing the way that Claudius is acting as a young man. He said there's times where Claudius makes a lot of sense and he has moments of clarity and he doesn't seem like he's disabled. And so from those correspondences, what people have come to believe, at least a lot of historians, is that maybe for his own survival, Claudius had seen, anybody that shows any competence or any leadership potential ends up being buried in the ground, right?
Yeah, they get murdered.
So if I act like that I'm not a threat to anybody and I'm never going to try to ascend to the throne, then maybe I'll be able to live. And so there are a lot of people that believe that was just survival instinct. Whether or not that's the case, we don't know. But regardless, Tiberius's nephew Caligula's incompetent uncle Claudius, was made emperor by the Praetorians after he was found cowering. Some believe, and they still believe, that he feigned his stupidity so that he wouldn't see a rival. And that originates with Suetonius in his writing in the 12 Emperors. And so he actually becomes a good leader. He has some building projects he engages in. He brings back stability. And so Claudius, who's this guy that nobody ever sees as a threat, becomes somebody who the Praetorians are happy with. He becomes a good leader. But Claudius had a problem. And Claudius, by the way, is the one who expels the Jews from Rome. I think that I maybe mistakenly said that it was Tiberius yesterday. I got my words tangled. But it's Claudius who expels the Jews from Rome. But he has a problem, and his weakness, as it is for a lot of leaders, is beautiful women. His third wife was 14 when he was 49, and she betrayed him and tried to marry somebody else for her trouble. Claudius has her executed, so he's not beyond execution either. His next wife was his niece and Caligula's sister. So let's go back again. So Caligula's sister, Agrippina the Younger, marries Claudius. And so she comes to power as his wife, and they actually have to change the law. because the laws of incest in Rome said that an uncle could not marry her niece. He had those laws changed so that he could marry her. And so he marries Caligula's sister, his own niece, and she starts negotiating with him because she has a son already. And his name is Nero, and that is from her first marriage. And so Nero is the stepson of Claudius. And so pretty soon after Nero reached the age of 16, which is the age of adulthood in the Roman world, all of a sudden Claudius gets sick and dies. And so it is widely believed that Agrippina the Younger poisoned her own husband so that her son Nero could ascend to the throne.
Do you blame her?
Well, I think it's a move that she would come to regret later in life, is all I'll say.
Kind of gave Nero some ideas.
Yes, and so that sort of leads us up to where we are. So let's get through these next two slides, and then we'll come back and take a break for lunch and come back. So Claudius is important in the New Testament in a variety of ways. He is the one that places Herod Agrippa on the throne. And we read about his persecution in Acts chapter 12. And so Herod Agrippa had grown up with all these Roman leaders. He had a personal relationship with Claudius.
So this is the first Herod Agrippa.
Herod Agrippa the first, yes.
Okay.
And so he's the grandson of Herod the Great. And he becomes, he comes to the throne, he persecutes the church, he banishes, Claudius does, the Jews from Rome in AD 49, that's recorded in Acts chapter 18. This actually is the only reason that Paul and Aquila and Priscilla meet, because Aquila and Priscilla have to leave Rome because of all the Jews being banished, and that's how Paul comes to meet Aquila and Priscilla and how they end up being so important to the ministry. So Nero comes to power. Very first thing he does is he murders his stepbrother, Britannicus. And so he's only 16 years old, and so he needs some help. And so we go back here to our little chart. We're trying to see the pieces here. So Britannicus is Claudius's son from this marriage. And so Nero immediately executes him, and he rules with his mother, Agrippina the Younger, and also with the help of his good friend Seneca, who is his advisor. Well, as he grows a little bit older, he grows tired of them. And there is evidence that in 59, Nero has a fever that kind of makes him go crazy. I'm sorry, I think that's actually Caligula that has the fever.
Yeah, Caligula
has the
has
fever.
a fever, and then
Yeah, and let me make sure what year that was, because that is an important thing to know.
murders all the senators that were like, I prayed that the gods would take my life instead of yours. And it was like, oh yeah, let's see it then.
Yeah, so after 8 months in power, Caligula has that great fever. Nero, though, after a few years, decides that he doesn't want any help ruling anymore. And so the first thing that he tries to do is murder his mother. However, you remember Agrippina the Younger is the one that poisoned Claudius. And so if she is stealthy enough and intelligent enough to murder the emperor, she's probably pretty smart. So the first thing that he tries to do is have his mother poisoned. Well, it turns out that she's been taking antidotes to every known poison for years. And so the poisoning won't work. So the next thing he tries to do is have her capsized in a boat, and so that she will drown. Well, guess what? Apparently she's a pretty good swimmer, so it doesn't work. So after 2 execution attempts to execute his own mother, he finally just sends a whole squadron of soldiers to murder her. And so he murders his mom. He sends Seneca off into exile. And so he has this vision to build this great thing called the Golden House, which was just a center of Roman debauchery. And so to do that, there's nowhere to build and there's objections to it. In 64, he just sets Rome on fire. And he blames Christians for it. And so he starts brutally punishing the Christians, even though he was the one that set the fire. So all of this is just causing worlds and worlds of problems. And so in 68 AD, he is declared an outlaw. There are 3 other men who lay claim to the throne, and they are named imperator, and he is proclaimed by the Senate an outlaw. And so he's going to be killed. And instead of doing that, he commits suicide in 68 AD. And so the time of turbulence is back. But there's going to be turbulence in a way that maybe there's never been turbulence before in 69 AD. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get back from our break. So let's go quickly down this order really quickly. So you've got Octavian from 27 BC to 14 AD. From 27 to 14, you get Augustus. From 14 to 37, you get Tiberius Caesar. Then from 37 to 41, you get Caligula, very short reign, just, categorized by wildness and craziness and all the things that happened. Then from 41 to 54, which is a period of stability and peace, you have Claudius, and then you get Nero from 54 to 68. So those things are in your notes that were uploaded into the LMS, but just kind of be aware of those dates and those people.
Could you read the dates just one more time?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. So from 27 to 14. So from 27 BC to AD 14, you have Augustus. From 14 to 37, you get Tiberius. Then from 37 to 41, you get Caligula.
41?
41. Mm-hmm. Then from 41 to 54, from 41 to 54, you get Claudius. And then from 54 to 68, you get Nero.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, that's a lot. That's a lot of information in a short time. And look, there's so much that we could talk about and discuss with those emperors. But that sort of gives you a good look at the instability that accompanied the beginning of the empire, in that first really, not even 100 years, 75 years or so. And so when we come back, we will look at the Flavian dynasty. We'll look at some of the other powers that be that existed, and then we'll call it a day. And I do want to, if you'll remind me, if I forget, I want to go back to that slide at the beginning of this.
Yeah, Jesus.
Yes, Jesus' birth. It's one of those things that needs to be discussed. All right.
Don't forget to pause.
Yes, I want to pause the recording.
You got it. That's
All right, picking up in our afternoon session here. And we want to jump back into something I said we were going to discuss, which was the birth of Jesus. And this is something that is very controversial. There will be folks that would argue with the things that we're going to say and would say there's no way that some of these things happen. They couldn't be true, but we're doing the best that we can because, as we shared earlier, time was not something that was all that significant and important to people in the ancient world. And so dates and times and such can be a little bit confusing. But we think we can narrow these things down. And we start with the name Quirinius. And so in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, it talks about Quirinius' governorship. And you can find this in this book on page 264. And so we know that this census was followed by attacks that led to a revolt, and so we can sort of date its authenticity and what became of it. And so we narrow it down in some way based on when Quirinius was governor. The second thing that we have to use is that these were censuses taken by Caesar Augustus. we have recorded two of them. One takes place in 8 BC, the other in AD 14. Well, we know that 14 is too late for what we're talking about. And so if we're going to believe the biblical narrative, which we should, it's somewhere around 8 BC. And then we also are told in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1 and Luke chapter 1 and verse 5 that Jesus was born in the time of Herod the Great. So Herod rules from 37 to 4 BC. And then, of course, we turn over to Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. Thus were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So now we're trying to take approximations, right? How long is a generation? How long is 14 generations? And so if you were to follow exactly to the common understanding of generations, it would end up somewhere around the year 26. And so we know these are approximations, but it's helping us to kind of narrow down the time period, right? On 265, there's a quote from Bell from Clement of Alexandria. It says, Clement discussed this problem of chronology and provided what information he had about the reigns of the emperors and the time that elapsed since the birth of Christ. By his reckoning, Jesus was born in the 28th year of Augustus. Modern scholars begin figuring Augustus's reign in 27 BC. So then that would make Jesus born in what? The year 180. However, Clement appears to have been counting it from the Battle of Actium in 31, which would place it around the year 3 BC. So we've got a number of different theories here. We've got the year 8, we've got the year 3, and so there's these different schools of thoughts. We also have to factor in the slaughter of the innocents, and so it has to be somewhere before 4 BC because Herod is alive. We don't have the recording of the slaughter of the innocents outside of the biblical account. Bell gives possible reasons for that, one being the huge infant mortality rate that existed, during this time or for whatever reason. But so we're trying to nail this down and figure it out. And so the best guess, and this is where I kind of fall, and I think this is where the book would fall, is somewhere between the year 8 and probably closer to the year 6 BC. Because that, it fits into the time of the census, which is 8 BC. It fits into the time of the rule of King Herod, which ended in 4 BC. And it seems like a logical place to go with that. Some people have tried to narrow down more specific dates. There is a story in your book, I think it's on 266. Are y'all familiar with Johann Kepler? Yeah, so Johann Kepler is a very, very famous, wow, word just left me. Somebody who studies the stars.
Astrologer, astronomer.
Astronomer, wow, that's the word I was looking for. I can tell it's been a long week. Kepler is a very famous astronomer. So Johann Kepler is most famous for, and I'm trying to find out some more details to share with you, the 3 laws of planetary motion, which talks about how the planets move. And very famous astronomer, one of the most. He's German, and he lived from 1571 to 1630. Also, yeah, this is the other thing. He's been described as the father of science fiction. he sort of came up with that idea. And so, one of the most famous astronomers ever, he said, and from his calculations, that Jesus had to be born between 7 and 6 BC during a rare conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, where the sky would have looked a certain way. And so, I don't know, one person says that it would have to have been March the 24th, the 25th in the year 5 BC. Because of a star map that was painting on the ceiling of a catacomb in Rome. Other of our friends, you and I, if we were to ask people, they would say without a doubt, Jesus was born on December the 25th of whatever year it was born. So there's a lot of discussion and arguments about the year of Jesus's birth, the month, whatever was going on. So our best guess from the things that we know is sometime between 8 BC and 6 BC. We know that more than likely he was not born in December because of the way the Bible describes it. And so hopefully that'll help you sort of narrow those things down. You'll hear, there's a guy that I watch on TikTok, and I'm sure some of you have seen him, Dan McClellan. You'll watch Dan McClellan ever? Dan McClellan is a guy that is a scholar, a very, very knowledgeable scholar. He came out of the Latter-day Saints movement, but now they probably wouldn't claim him because he's very liberal in his scholarship. But he actually last year won the highest award that you can receive from the Society of Biblical Literature. Just really, really smart guy. But anyway, I just watched a video of him where he claims that there's no record of census has taken place and that the whole story is concocted. And so there's all different people, from the most conservative of our brethren in the pew to the most liberal of scholars who debate and argue about this. And the truth is, all we can do is give our best guess and just go from there. All right, thoughts on that? I just wanted to kind of jump you in the middle of that.
If you use not the is it the chronological Bible? Which one is it that it puts I can't even think about it. It shows the actual times of when different scriptures are actually put together to show the order, and we get closer to April Fool's Day more than we get to Christmas. But I guess my overall thing is it's important that we need to understand the birth of Jesus, because that's where the pillar of Christianity. If you take away the birth of his incarnation, that's what I'm more concerned with.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of. But in other ways, the birth of Jesus is much less significant than his death and resurrection, right? And so it's so strange to me that Christmas is a much bigger holiday than Easter by our religious friends that celebrate those religious holidays. The birth of Jesus pales in comparison to the power of his resurrection. I mean, that's the single most important event in human history versus celebrating his birth. There's a lot of mystery surrounding Jesus's early life that we don't have answers to. The biggest one that fascinates me is what happens to Joseph.
Yeah.
Joseph disappears from the biblical narrative. And, the most common understanding is that he dies. But, how do you have this character who's so important to the biblical narrative? He's literally the earthly father of Jesus. And then all of a sudden, by the time of the crucifixion, he's gone. Right. We have Jesus before John saying, this is your son, this is your mother. And so, there's lots of things we don't know about his early life. We only get really one picture of his life. And of course, that's Jesus at the temple at 12 years old. But we just don't know.
And then the marking of the slaughter of the innocents is, I think that's probably one of the huge, it's probably one of the saddest stories you could read in the Bible. The power and greed of man to destroy God's only begotten Son so they can maintain power. But I think that the other part that in this is important is that if you still recognize the completeness of Jesus, like you said, there are pictures, but we had this conversation at lunch. If we don't know, let's just say we don't know. and let's move forward to what we do know. Because what we do have is much more than we could ever know, and we don't want to accept that. In one of our classes with the Synoptic Gospels, it's, I think, 40% of the Gospels are written on the last 2 to 3 weeks of Jesus' life. And so when you read that in John, all the things that Jesus did is not written in this book. If it was, the world couldn't contain all that was written. But there's enough that is written that we should believe that Jesus is the Christ, he's the Son of God, and that we have life in his name. So I try to stay at points, to the humanity part, but never forgetting the deity part. Because if you take that away, Christianity, then what are we fighting for? You can't get to the hope because you didn't believe hope came. Hope came.
Yeah, you said something this morning in one of the discussions we were having that stuck with me. That sometimes in the way that we preach the Bible but take out the hope, and that is kind of sometimes how we do it, right? We beat people over the head with it, take out the hope. I thought that was a good observation. All right, so let's jump back in. The powers that be, part 2. So the year of the 4 emperors. So chaos, right? AD 69, Nero commits suicide. You have 4 emperors. And so we're going to talk about him very briefly. Galba. He rules for 7 months from the 8th of June, AD 68 to January 15th of 69. We don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know that he is not the emperor for very long. Suetonius writes a little bit about him. And, we have that understanding and description, but we just don't know much about him other than he dies. And so he is assassinated on, what did I say in January?
We said the 13th.
Yes, the 15th of January. He is assassinated. There is a mutiny led by the next guy, who is Otho. And we don't know too much about him either, other than he was one of the people that was fighting for the guard. If you want to go back and read about these people, you certainly can. I'm not trying to diminish their importance, but they only served for a very short time. So Galba is assassinated, and Marcus Salvius Otho comes to the throne. He lasts from January 15th until the 16th of April. So not a very long time, but he overthrows Galba. He takes over, and just for a little bit of time he's ruling, and he goes to war with Vitellius, and he is killed in battle, he ends up stabbing himself in the heart with a dagger, and so he commits suicide because he knows that Vitellius is about to take the throne. And so then Vitellius I think I always mess his name up when I say it, rules for 8 months from the 19th of April to the 20th of December. And interestingly, he gains popularity by rallying support from Nero. So it's like Nero had become this kind of mythical figure, and it was almost like the more you could be reminded of Nero, the more popular he would become. And there was this pervasive theory for a long time that Nero was going to return, that he wasn't really dead, that he would return and come back. And so Vitellius is there until December, and he doesn't last that long either, because he is challenged by Vespasian, who is going to come into power. So Vespasian captures and executes Vitellius, and that ends the reign of those three guys, right? So their executions and assassinations, and they're not there very long. But finally, Vespasian comes to pass. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do have it as a bullet point. Some people insist on AD 69 as the date for the book of Revelation. They base that on the passage about the three-headed beast. And they say that that represents these three guys that ruled for a short time. And as we've talked about a little bit already this week, it just doesn't add up numbers-wise, doesn't seem to. But that is something that's pointed to. And Bell actually kind of throws his support that way. If you've read the chapter, just sort of in that paragraph, he says that could be when it is. He doesn't just sort of take a dogmatic approach to it, but he does say that that's a possibility. So just kind of know that. This is not a Revelation class, so we're not going to try to date it, but that is a date that's thrown out there. So all this chaos, year of the four emperors. Nero's gone. These three guys are gone. And here we end up with Vespasian. And he rules for a decade and brings some stability after what's been a really turbulent year. And he has a son named Titus. You know that Titus is the one that goes in AD 70 and destroys the city of Jerusalem. 3 years later, he lays siege to Masada and finishes off the battle and the defeat of the Jews. For us theologically, that marks the final split of Christianity and Judaism. I think it is symbolically God severing his ties with the Jews forever. But so that is definitely the significance for us of Vespasian and Titus. But Vespasian is there, and he is aggressively suppressing this uprising. And a lot of the Jews gave up the fight. And most notable here is when we get Josephus. So you have heard that Josephus' name is Flavius Josephus. That's because after he gives up the fight, he becomes the Roman historian of the Jews. And so he writes the Jewish history for the Roman record books and actually almost becomes adopted into the family, and he takes on that name. And so this is a significant time, for Jewish history. So Vespasian rules during a peaceful 10 years. He destroys the Golden House, which was a big moment for the people, and he is the one who begins construction on the Colosseum. Of course, we're very familiar with the Roman Colosseum. Jake's probably been there. Sorry, Jake. But the Roman Colosseum, and it's a very, very important landmark even to this day, and this dates all the way back to Vespasian. Titus, his son, is not nearly as successful. So Titus has to come back and take over after his father, and during his reign in 2 years, Mount Vesuvius explodes. There's another fire that breaks out in Rome, and there's a giant epidemic that sweeps the empire. So Titus is much more remembered for his conquering of Jerusalem than he is for any success that he had as emperor. And so along comes Domitian. The prevalent thought is that he murders his older brother. And in the 90s, he becomes very, very paranoid. He starts arresting people that he thought were plotting against him. And this probably includes a very, very harsh persecution of Christians. And once again, back to Revelation, I think most of our brothers would fall into this category, that this is the persecution that's being described in the book of Revelation while John is there in exile. And so that sort of gets you to the end of these emperors. And so for our purposes, we need to know from Julius Caesar down to Domitian, right? So where you think about Julius Caesar, then you think about Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, then the year of the four emperors, then Vespasian, then Titus, and Domitian. And that gets you to the end of the first century. A lot of people in charge in a century, right? And so there are times of peace, though. It looks like it's all chaos. Vespasian rules a peaceful 10 years. Claudius and Tiberius, and especially Augustus, they really do well. But it's all the crazy in the middle, right? With Little Boots, Caligula, and with Nero especially, and with the year after Nero and Titus and Domitian that sort of makes it remembered for all of the chaos.
Well, and the way you have your slide title, the powers that be, this is the transition where they shifted from a free republic and worship to emperor worship.
Yeah.
Emperor, and that's why, most brothers would agree with the Revelation thought, because Domitian really carried that thought of, you're going to worship me as a god. And Nero started going that way, but Domitian finished that thought. I mean, that was his look. You don't bow down to me. It's a pretty ugly sight.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, just sort of know those things. There was one more thing I wanted to look at here before we move past the emperors. You can tell that I really liked this book. I highlighted and wrote and all kind of stuff in here. It's actually falling apart. I've taught this class for this school and for the Georgia School of Preaching. It's been a couple of years, so I have to remind myself of things as I go through and look at it. Yes, what I wanted to look at was page 65. We had this discussion earlier about Nero starting the fire in Rome and blaming it on the Christians. I gave my middle schoolers a quiz on this several months ago, and they remembered it by, you remember in The Office where Ryan started the fire? Yeah, so that's how they remember it. Nero started the fire. So if that helps you remember it, that's a good way to make light of it, I guess. But it says here in the book, nothing that the emperor did, neither gifts to the crowds nor sacrifices to the gods, could overcome the popular belief that he had ordered the fire to be set. To squelch the rumor, he accused a class of people called Christians, who were despised by the people for their crimes and inflicted the most elaborate tortures on them. Christus, the origin of the name, was crucified by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Though checked for a crime, this deadly superstition erupted again not only in Judea, where the evil originated, but even in Rome, where everything hideous and shameful flows together and is relished. First, those who pleaded guilty were arrested. Then on their testimony, a huge crowd of people was convicted, not so much of arson as of hatred of mankind. Disgrace was heaped on their deaths. Covered in the pelts of wild animals, they were torn to death by dogs, or were crucified, or were set on fire as torches when the daylight had faded. However, people began to feel sympathy for them, even though they were criminals deserving extreme punishment as an example. It seemed that they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's cruelty. And that, of course, is from Tacitus, who's a Roman historian. And so it's sort of interesting that Nero's persecution probably helped the expanding of Christianity, because people started to feel sympathy for the cruelty that they endured at the hands of Nero. And so it's a good thing, and we don't have time because of the scope of this class, but when you do have time, whether you're writing a paper or studying things more soundly, is to go back and look at the primary sources from that time and see, the things that they had to say. And that gives us a picture of the world maybe more than anything we know, because we know that history's been rewritten, and once you get to other sources that come much later, it's hard to know and rely on them. But when we have these early sources that can tell us things, it's almost like hearing them from the mouth of people that lived through it, which is pretty amazing, pretty important. And so when you have the chance, certainly do that. All right, so let's jump ahead here. There is a quote on page 68. And so he talks about the the influence of the emperors on the New Testament. He says, Luke chapter 2, verse 1 credits Augustus with ordering a census which brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. When Herod the Great died, as stated in Matthew 2, Mary and Joseph felt they could return from Egypt. So we're seeing how the emperors influenced the biblical narrative. But when they went to Nazareth to avoid Archelaus, whom Augustus confirmed as king over Judea, that's Herod the Great's son, in Samaria, Tiberius appointed Pilate to govern as prefect of Judea and left him there to stew for 10 years, ruling during the time of Jesus' public ministry. Caligula's demand for divine honors heightened the tensions that led to the War of 66 to 73, which in turn completed the split between Christianity and Judaism. Claudius drove the Jews out of Rome in 49, sending Aquila and Priscilla to Corinth, where they met Paul. Nero banished the author of Revelation to that tiny island where he saw his vision, and he probably ordered the executions of Peter and Paul as well. I think that might be a stretch. Those are things that we don't know for sure, but certainly we see the impact that these emperors had on the story of the New Testament. And it's interesting to see how the history and the biblical narrative sort of come together to help us understand it more. And I think alongside that, understanding these people will do that for us as well. So let's look at some of the different titles that are mentioned here. One is the proconsul, and that is the highest office in Rome. And we get the whole process of that at the bottom of 68. Says that a proconsul is a man who held the highest office in Rome, the consulship. Each year, beginning around 200 BC, the Senate assigned governorships by lot to the available pool of former consuls. By allowing the Senate to select governors to the quieter provinces, the emperors maintained the fiction of a republic and rewarded men who had made their way up the bureaucratic ladder. Most aristocratic Romans regarded the task as a necessary evil with some degree of prestige attached. Some, like Cicero, actively resented it because it took them away from Rome for a year or more. Occasionally, a man who held the second highest office in the state, the praetorship, would be sent to one of the smaller provinces if a proconsul was not available. And so we see here two really high offices that you could have in Rome. And these would have been people who had a direct relationship with the emperor, who would have been designated and chosen to rule in those capacities. The next class that we see sort of described here in the next section would have been deputies of the emperor. Deputies of the emperor. And these would have been people that ruled in smaller provinces. So we see these terms in the Bible: procurator, prefect. These are names that we see. We also see the term governor, and governor is more of a generic term that's applied to the head of a province. And so these were people that worked hand in hand with the emperor in this provincial system. And so when you see these titles, we need to know what they are and who they are. Most of the time when we get to these characters in the New Testament, we're looking at people who were deputies, right? Or governors, people like Pilate and those key characters. We never get too much interaction with the higher ups in Rome, although we do get some interaction, and we certainly get interaction with the higher ups in the Jewish system when we get to the Herods and such that we see in the book of Acts. The most interaction that we get with Roman leaders is where in the Bible?
Pilate.
Well, more so, yeah, even Pilate. Who else?
Felix.
Yeah, so the end of the book of Acts, Paul's journey to Rome, is where we see some of these characters, and we'll look at some of those as we go on later in the week. So the other thing that we need to mention with some of these folks are the publicani, or the publicans, as we see in our King James Version, or tax collectors, tax farmers. I know that you guys know this because this is something we've taught you since you learned who Zacchaeus was in Bible school, but the tax collection system in Rome was very, very corrupt. And so what you had was basically everybody could go and, these people were assigned to collect taxes, but they could pass that down or subcontract it to other people. And as long as the subcontractors got what they were supposed to get, anything else that they took from people, they could keep for themselves. And so it was very corrupt, very filthy. Matthew, of course, leaves behind his job as a tax collector and follows Jesus. Zacchaeus comes down from his tree and meets Jesus. And the Bible says not only does he stop doing that, but what else did he do?
Oh, he repented. He wanted to get back. He wanted to restore.
Yeah. So he paid back anything that he had taken and made everything right and restored, made people whole. So we've seen sort of the Roman leaders. What about the intersection? Why is that so small? The intersection of the Romans and the Jews. And there's one of these little boxes. And I love these little boxes in this book. This is from Tacitus as well. And it talks about a Roman view of Judaism. And so it says, many sources agree that a plague which disfigured the body broke out in Egypt. King Macorus consulted the oracle of Ammon to find a remedy and was ordered to cleanse his kingdom by carrying this race so hated by the gods into another land. The people, hunted out and herded together, were dumped in a desert. As the others sat stunned and weeping, one of the exiles, Moises, advised them not to look for help from the gods or from men, for they had been abandoned by both. They should take as their divine leader the one who would first help them overcome their present misery. After a journey of 6 consecutive days, on the 7th day, they took over a country, driving out the inhabitants, and founded a city and a temple. This sounds like the remix of the Exodus, right? So they say that they didn't escape from Egypt, that to cleanse the kingdom, they took this race so hated by the gods and dumped them in the desert. Well, it's a little bit different than the story that we read in the Bible, but this is the Roman view of it. In order to strengthen his control over this nation for posterity, Moises established new rituals, contrary to those of all other peoples. They considered profane those things which we hold sacred, yet they allow things which are forbidden among us. This form of worship, however it originated, is supported by its antiquity. There are other traditions which are perverse and debased, gain their strength from their very badness. The Romans did not understand Jews. They just didn't. If they had, they could have avoided so much violence, so much grief, so much destruction, right? From Nero not understanding why you would not put a statue in the temple. And you may remember this story if you go all the way back to Pompey. Pompey, when he went to Judea, do you remember what he did?
Yeah, he defamed the temple.
He walked into the Holy of Holies.
Yeah, he was surprised that they would fight so hard for something that they had lost.
And something so empty.
Yeah, that was his comment.
Yeah, so there's this long time of misunderstanding that exists between Rome and between Judea, and so we see just some of the history there and some of the confusion, and so all the way back to Pompey, there's this, and even before then, of course, there's this antagonistic attitude of Rome and of the Jews, and the Jews were never going to be able to defeat the Romans, but we see several uprisings that caused that.
Well, the opposite of it is also is that the Jews were heavy into discipline, yet when it came to their own pleasures, they had no discipline.
Yeah.
And they couldn't understand that because God taught discipline toward the body and toward the mind and the spirit, where they wanted the freedom to do whatever they want.
So back in the history part of this, back to Pompey. And you guys probably know this from your intertestamental stuff, and this is in the book as well. But Pompey comes in and chooses Hyrcanus over Aristobulus, but there's still kind of civil war, and it's just sort of a mess. But that brings us to the characters that we need to talk the most about as it relates to Jewish and Roman relations, and that is really, you can take it back to Antipater. Antipater is the father of Herod the Great, and Antipater is the one who establishes this relationship. You know that the Herods are from Idumea. We've talked about that a couple of times, and Antipater at this time is the governor of Idumea, and his two sons, they learned it from their father how to kind of play the right political cards, right? So they come in and, Antipater sends assistance to Julius Caesar, but then after his assassination, he supports Brutus and Cassius. Well, then after Brutus and Cassius are defeated, he throws his support to Caesar Augustus. And so they learn to sort of go the way that the wind blows. And so they learn to do this. But there's a paragraph about halfway down on page 71. The late 40s saw considerable turmoil in Judea. Antipater was murdered in 43. A Parthian invasion in 40 resulted in Aristobulus' son being proclaimed ruler of Jerusalem, with Hyrcanus taken captive to Mesopotamia. Antipater's sons reacted to the crisis quite differently. One commits suicide while the other escapes to Rome. And then, of course, we know that Herod later returns as king, appointed, interestingly, by Mark Antony. But then when Mark Antony, as we talked about earlier, is killed, he becomes a big supporter of Octavian. I love this little paragraph after that. Few of the territories gave the Romans as much trouble or as little benefit as Judea. Jones calls it the classic instance of an intractable area. And so every time they turn around, this little province was giving them all sorts of trouble. And certainly we can attest to some of the issues that came from that. So Herod the Great comes in. His father had been the governor of Idumea. He's appointed king by Mark Antony. He dies in 4 BC, and then his 3 sons take over land. I think we briefly talked about this yesterday at the beginning of class. So you get Herod Antipas, you get Archelaus, and you get Herod Philip. And this is discussed in the middle of page 72. Herod's kingdoms divided among his 3 surviving sons, who each received the title of ethnarch. Philip's domain consisted of several obscure territories east of the Jordan. Antipas was given Galilee and Perea, beyond the Jordan, while Archelaus was to govern Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. But Archelaus ruled so brutally that his subjects finally begged Augustus to rescue them from his tyranny. This situation was behind Joseph's decision to avoid Judea while Archelaus was in power, and he was deposed from office and banished to Gaul in AD 6. And so we see that the sons learn from their father. They are equally as cruel, and Archelaus is eventually banished because of how cruel he is. And so his time only lasts for about a decade, right? From 4 BC to 6 AD. Then we read about Pilate. He was the prefect. Some of the Bible versions call him a governor. But remember we said that a prefect or a governor, that they were a deputy. And he's there from AD 26 to 36 or 37. The book actually kind of makes it sound like it was punishment, almost, if you remember. That it was, a punishment for the way that he was, perceived, or whatever it might have been. Pilate is actually one of those characters that we have proof of his existence. Do you know the artifact we have that proves Pilate's existence?
The stone was found at Caesarea, I think. Yes. Pontius Pilatus or something in Latin.
Yeah, and so it's actually a stone that was part of the dedication of a temple. It looks like that Pilate had dedicated a temple, I believe, to Caesar Augustus. And so we have that Pilate stone, and it's one of those kind of crucial pieces of archaeological history that we have. And so Pilate exists. We know he's the prefect of Judea. He was not popular among the Jews. he was always trying to handle things in the right way, and it never went right for him. And I think maybe if I was writing a paper, I might choose to write it on Pilate's relationship with the Jews. Josephus tells us that Pilate arrived into the night and snuck his soldiers' legendary standards in the cover under darkness. And the Jews didn't like that because they had figures on them of the emperor or animals. And so the people protested for several days, demanding that he move them. He threatened to have the soldiers lop their heads off, and all the Jewish people did was held their heads like this and said, cut me right here. No fear, right? And so rather than risk a bloodbath in his first week, he yielded to the Jews' demands and he removed the standards. Another time, though, he stands his ground. He had used the Jewish temple funds to finance the construction of an aqueduct. So a mob shows up to his house and he had the soldiers beat them with clubs. And so it seems like they're clashing all the time because they're bringing in the worship of false gods. He's stealing money, and for whatever reason, they just didn't get along. Well, I think that may help us understand his lack of willingness to free Jesus. Because the Jews very clearly and very obviously want him, to crucify Jesus in every way. And so you can almost show a little sympathy for him because he's trying to.
That part that you mentioned where they're like cut right here, Pilate says his blood is on your hands.
Yeah.
Like, let it be on us and all our children.
Yeah.
So it's the same mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And he doesn't want to cause another disruption because Jesus is nobody to him. And so he's just trying to satisfy and pacify the Jews. And so, he says, let his blood be on your hands, like you said. He's trying to just do whatever the crowd wants, so they don't turn against him and form another mob. And I think that helps us understand his action or lack of action. Certainly doesn't excuse it, but we get that picture of him and his account with Jesus. And so that's Pontius Pilate. Sergius Paulus, we read about in Acts chapter 13. Turn over there really quickly.
Wasn't he a pro? No, that's 14. Yeah, that's 14. I was thinking about the proconsul now.
Yeah. Chicken salad chicken has not been kind to me. Feels like it's just sitting right there.
Yeah, it probably is.
So, jump in here. I want to show you a little bit about this. Let's chase a rabbit for just a second. So Paul's first journey here. We see some people here. Bar Jesus and Elymas, that's the same person. So Bar Jesus is his name, but Elymas is a title that means description. And so when they go on this missionary journey, they're going to start in Antioch in Syria, and they go to Seleucia. Then they sail to the island of Cyprus. They land on the eastern side of it, which is Salamis, and then they cross over to Paphos, which is the western port city. They go to Perga, that's where John Mark leaves. Then they go up to Antioch and Pisidia, to Iconium, Lystra and Derbe, where the people hail them as gods. And then they go to Italia, and then they head back to Antioch in Syria. But when they get to, there's a picture of it, if you're interested in those things.
Did you change your PowerPoint?
I did.
Okay, you did.
Yeah, sorry, I'll go back.
No, you're good. You're good.
So anyway, when they get to Cyprus, which is this island here, Cyprus has its own governor. His name is Sergius Paulus.
Where Barnabas is from, I think. Cyprus.
Sorry, one of our members just fell and broke their nose. Ouch. Okay. It's okay. But yes, Barnabas is from there, whoever said that. Absolutely right. And so he's the governor of Cyprus. And so we see these governors, put here. And so It's not a bad place to govern, nice little island in the middle of the Mediterranean. And so when you see his title there, Sergius Paulus is the governor of this area. By the way, this was another PowerPoint made by Canvas. That slide was already there. It was kind of easy to put it together. Anyhow. We read about Gallio, who is the proconsul of Achaia in Acts chapter 18. And what do we know about the province of Achaia? What very, very important city is there?
Corinth,
Yeah, Corinth. And so when we see things like the Corinthian games and we see Paul's correspondence with the Corinthian church, these are all people that live in Achaia. And Gallio is the deputy of that area. And then we see Seneca, who is Gallio's brother. And you may remember in our earlier discussion, he was Nero's tutor. And along with Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mom, they sort of ruled the empire while Nero was younger. And then he had him sent far, far away into exile. So just think about these characters. And I know there's so many names in the Bible. And one of the things that I hear from people all the time is, especially in our study of Acts, is, man, there's so many names to remember. It's okay. You don't have to remember all of them all the time, but just kind of have a little bit of knowledge of who they are. Yes?
Gallio is one of those that's really fascinating to me. You may be familiar with, I just call it the Gallio stone. It's a stone that was found, and now it's in a museum in Delphi, Greece. And that stone is written in Greek and has Gallio's name in it. And it's that stone that helps us and historians and scholars place the timeline of when and where Paul actually was, because that stone was written around 52 AD, so you can place Paul in Corinth around 52 because we know that Gallio was proconsul around that time.
Okay.
So he goes to or the judgment seat in Corinth. That honestly gives us a point in time where we can then backtrack. Remember Terry Edwards talking to us about that and just how important Gallio is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's just sort of a name that's mentioned in the Bible, but it gives you the ability to go back through archaeology, through secular history, to figure out exactly who he is. And so just a few more names that you need to know.
I think Jake just volunteered to write Gallio's.
To write what?
He's Gallio's
Paper.
free paper.
Yeah.
All right. So some more characters that we mentioned. So we get Felix, who is the governor of Judea. And so we're talking about here some, 20 years or so after Pontius Pilate. And Felix was a slave of Claudius's mother. Now think back, right? That Claudius is Nero's uncle, who was found cowering in the castle. But his mother, who was named Antonius, had Felix as a slave. And somehow he comes all the way up and he marries Drusilla, who is the sister of Herod Agrippa II, who's mentioned in Acts chapter 24. And so not only does he have interaction with the Roman emperor, but he also ends up marrying the sister of a king. And so we read about him in Acts chapter 24, and I think we talked a little bit about it yesterday, his interaction with Paul. Festus replaces Felix, and he only survives a couple of years, and he's ends up being replaced as well. And there's several other minor characters that are mentioned in the book, in the chapter by Bell. And we're not going to spend too much time worrying about some of those folks. But one of them was Quirinius. Then there are several soldiers that are mentioned. The Roman centurion Cornelius, the tribune Claudius Lysias, who's mentioned in Acts chapter 26. Theophilus. Let's talk about Theophilus for a second.
Oh, Theophilus.
So, what have you heard about Theophilus? First off, who are we talking about when we say Theophilus?
A Here's an individual that Paul was, sorry, that's,
No, go ahead.
that Paul mentions, and I don't know how many of his letters.
It's actually Luke that,
Oh, is it?
that writes to Theophilus, yeah,
Oh,
in
that's right.
the book of Luke and the book of Acts.
You're right.
So who is Theophilus?
Theophilus is supposed to be a prominent figure
Yeah,
in
Roman official.
the Roman government. He is from Luke chapter 1. He is possibly a Christian, not saying he's a Christian, but he's been taught the ways of God. And the book of Luke and Acts are to help in a chronological order to strengthen his faith and belief that Christianity and how the events occurred. That's why Luke takes the way of being more detailed in the events and certain things that Luke, he characterizes that the other parts of the Synoptic Gospel don't, but it's important because it's written to Theophilus.
Yeah, so all that's correct. So the name actually means God lover, Theophilus, right? And you take, of course, the Greek word for God and the Greek word for love and put them together, you get Theophilus. So there's a couple of different theories. So most people believe this is some Roman official, and Bell lists some possibilities. Some have suggested Domitian's cousin, Flavius Clemens. Some have suggested that Sergius Paulus, who we mentioned earlier, was there. I want to throw another thing at you, though, that I think is interesting. There is a group of scholars who they don't believe that Theophilus was actually a person at all, that it was a dedication to all of those who love God, rather than being written to a specific person. Because Theophilus is a title, not a name. And so that is one possibility that's out there. And so we don't know who it is. It's one of those mysteries, that we just don't know about. And so just another one of those things to think about. Dionysius, the Areopagite, is mentioned. I think we mentioned them yesterday, and so some other characters. But I want to close by reading the conclusion here on 83, and then we'll talk about a couple other things. The church in the mid-1st century AD faced two external problems simultaneously. One, how to define its relationship with Judaism. And second, how to gain legal standing in the eyes of the Roman government. And so whenever we think about this first century world, it's so important for us to think about it on both of those fronts. Because first off, if not, the names will just all start to run together and it'll become a mishmash of chaos. And that's why I saved the Judean world for Thursday, because we're going to get all the Roman stuff out of the way first. So when we're thinking about all the characters that we've talked about, we're talking about mostly Roman people, right? The emperors and governors and prefects and all these. We did mention, of course, some Jewish characters, but even the Herods, even though they have Jewish origins, they are Roman leaders. They have been appointed as client kings by the Romans. And so all these characters are Roman in their designation and in their origin. So I think we just need to be mindful of that. But the Jews are trying to figure out, the Christians are trying to figure out, how do we interact with the Jews who they still have close relationship with? You remember Paul prays over and over for the Jews to be saved, right? He loves them still. Romans, I think chapter 11 or chapter 9.
Chapter 10. My prayer, heart's desire for Israel that it might be saved, Father. I bear the record, I have zeal for God.
Okay, yeah. So you're right, the very beginning of Romans chapter 10, yeah. And so he's, begging for them to be saved. So they're trying to figure out how to interact with them while also keeping their place in the Roman world. It's important to remember that Christ was persecuted and the early church was persecuted, not just by the Romans, not just by the Neros and the Domitians of the world, but by their Jewish friends as well. I think that understanding gives us a much better insight to things like the book of Hebrews. Because, you're talking about these people who are just feeling all of this pressure to revert back to their Jewish roots. And so that'll help us sort of think about them. So we're going to finish tomorrow as well with all the Roman stuff, and then we'll jump into Thursday in the Jewish part of all of that.
The other part is when we closely look at it, Jesus was tried with 6 trials, 3 to the Romans, 3 to the Jews. To me, as I was studying that and listening to that, learning more about it, it shows more of a qualification why he died for the sins of the world. The Jews wanted to kill him before he even went to Caesar, went through to the Roman law. The Romans found him still not guilty, but yet he still died for all mankind. It's a powerful statement to really see the love of God in action and fulfillment. So even later, as we read the Apostle Paul, he goes to reason with the Jews in his normal fashion. He's at the synagogue, he's debating, he's teaching, he's showing. He says, okay, you guys don't want to accept it, I'll go to the Gentile. Powerful.
Yeah, absolutely right. So let's talk about the rest of the class for a little bit. So tomorrow, we're going to look at chapters 5 and 6, which are Greco-Roman philosophy and Greco-Roman religion. And then actually we're going to look at society and relationships too. So we're really covering 4 sections. Of course, we won't get into all of it, but we'll talk about things like the cults. We'll talk about things like Stoicism and Epicureanism, things that I know that y'all know from your studies, but we'll dive into them a little deeper. We'll look at all these different structures of society, personal relationships. So tomorrow will be a kind of chunky because we're trying to cover a whole bunch of stuff. Have y'all given any more thought to your papers since yesterday? Anybody have any ideas? What are you thinking?
Writing on the Herods.
Okay, that'd be great. I'm excited to read that. Jake, Mike, y'all know anything about it?
You mentioned Galileo, but also, didn't you mention when Andreas, I forget who mentioned
Yeah, he
it,
wrote on the Jewish sects.
wrote on the
For a
Jewish
different
sects?
class.
Like this, if I remember right, there were 4 main ones: Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and Essenes.
Yes.
Herodians.
Herodians too.
Yes,
but
the major point.
If I remember correctly, that was for this class. And if I remember correctly, yeah, I think that was for this class 2 years ago. And the ones that we covered, it was 5 of them. Sadducees, Pharisees, Herodians, Zealots, and Essenes. And so, that's an interesting paper as well. Mike, you giving any thought?
I'm really probably leaning towards the powers that be. I think that's a vast story that we can still teach today. Because we have to learn to submit to civilian authority, civil authority.
You're talking about not the specific people, but the overall thought. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the overall thought. And I blended a couple of people to show but that's just a thought.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. How does Dave set it up for you guys to do research? Do you have access to journals, or how do you do
We
your
have
research?
access to Logos,
Okay.
which has a lot of it on there.
Okay.
I believe it's called Google Scholar,
Mhm.
that you can get a lot of really good research paper, and it also cites it for you.
Yeah.
But I use that as well.
Okay.
If that's all right with you.
Yeah, no, that's great. When you're writing these papers, you don't want a lot of popular, things. You're not quoting, citing websites and that sort of stuff. And so, we're just looking for scholarly articles, scholarly books, that
I
kind of
use
stuff.
that Google Scholar for like the historical side of it, because I wrote on Roman emperors, and so had a lot of things about history with that.
Yeah, and so when you're looking for your sources, you're looking for evidences of peer review, evidences of scholarly research. If you're looking at, publishers like Erdman's, these are the well-known biblical publishers. Or I'm also fine with sources that are within our brotherhood, even if they're not peer reviewed. I think that for the scope of what we're doing and, that we're teaching doctrine that we want to fall into the scope of our brotherhood, that I'm fine with those too. So if you have a an Earl Edwards or a Justin Rogers, these guys that are scholars within our brotherhood, I'm fine with you citing them as well.
David Life.
Right, yeah, you may have a book, at home that's in your library or something that, that has depth to it, or one of these Truth for Today commentaries. I'm fine with you citing those as well. Scholarly commentaries are really good to give you backgrounds and stuff. You don't want to quote just commentaries, because commentaries aren't always, coming up with unique ideas. That's the cool thing about these journal articles, is to contribute them to the catalog of academia, you've got to come up with a unique thought, that if you just write the same thing, it's not going to be accepted by peer-reviewed groups. So, that kind of stuff is what we want.
Sometimes I'll take their class notes and I'll create a citation for them.
Okay.
Because there's some stuff that is profound that has been researched like over and over again. Why do I have to go back and find it?
Yeah.
It says the same thing, and you've worded it just the way it's been worded.
Yeah.
I mean, not to be lazy, but I just.
No, yeah.
I think that,
Bell does great, but I think I showed you yesterday. So for instance, if you're going to write about the Jewish sects, well, you get to the end of that chapter where he talks about it, you're going to have 100 sources.
Yeah.
You go through and pick the ones that you want, and if they're available, you have those. If they're not available, try to get your hands on them in any way that you can. Make Dave order.
Yeah, Dave, here's our new reading list, 86.
One of the things that I loved when I was a grad student at Freed was just going through and, finding these journal articles, you would find something obscure and you could find 10 journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles that help you see all sorts. I wrote a paper one time about, the role, I think it was the passage in 1 Peter where it calls women the weaker vessel. You had all these different perspectives on what that meant. It just helps you really think about things in different ways. And so I'm looking forward to reading y'all's papers. They're not going to be read, in a way to be critical. I'm not reviewing it for a journal. We're just, we're looking for evidence of research and study on some of these things. And if you have questions or need help with any of that, I'm here to help you. I told you yesterday there were some things that I was going to share in the class, but I don't remember what they were. So you can try to remind me. I don't
You
I
had a
think it
couple
was
of
about that Jesus more.
Well, a couple of PowerPoints that you had, the first PowerPoint that you had, dealing with the fire, those PowerPoints weren't loaded in.
Okay.
I wanted to share those. We went over those. We opened up the class with that. And then you wanted to share an author book or something.
Oh, the Rummage book. Yes. That's one of the things about preaching through the Bible or preaching through a year.
I can remember that.
Yeah. So I'll try to share
That's
that.
right, yeah. Okay, I remember now.
Stop falling asleep.
I'm sorry.
So we'll try to share all that stuff as well. So, we're going to get out a little early today. So just be kind of looking at some of that stuff tonight and try to have a good idea tomorrow where you're going with a paper, and maybe go ahead and try to dig up a couple of sources if you can. I'm not going to ask you guys to read 4 sections of this book tonight, but maybe skim them, highlight some things that jump out to you. And if you have some questions, kind of come on with those. And, like I said, we're going to cover a lot of stuff tomorrow as far as these things. Look, we're not going to hit all of them in great detail, but we need to have a good idea of who these people are, and it will give insight to your Bible reading and sermon preparation and things.
Say chapters 5 and 6.
I think that we're actually going to cover tomorrow chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8.
Okay.
So, like I said, we won't dive into every single aspect of it, but we'll jump and we're going to get to, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Socrates and Plato. This is not an introduction to philosophy class, but we'll spend more time on the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Cynics and all those things that inform our understanding of the Bible. And certainly early Greek philosophy does. I mean, it has a huge influence on ancient culture, but so we'll go there as well. The PowerPoints should already be uploaded in the class.
I believe so. There's a bunch of them.
Except the new ones that you have to get. When Dave sent, when you send that to him, he'll upload this and send us a message. But he hasn't. I think he's leaving Thursday.
Yeah, I think he is leaving Thursday, so.
Yeah, that's right. That's what it is.
Yeah, he's leaving
We're
Thursday.
trying to get out of town. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so these are already loaded in here, so. All right. The test, somebody asked me this yesterday, and I've been sort of thinking about it. What I'll do with the test is probably like sometime next week, I'll upload it. And you'll have, from then. And so I think we said the first week of November to answer that, email it back. And just, it'll be, I probably will put a few like just multiple choice or matching, just identify these people. And then there'll be some short answer type questions and maybe one essay question. I don't want you to send me a book, but just to make sure that you're retaining some of those things and, make sure that we're learning and applying those things. And so that you'll have, 2 or 3 weeks to get back as well. So I want y'all to have a good time this week. I know that this is an intense program that y'all signed up for. I mean, some of the classes and the depth and the time. I remember the first time I came seeing Jet and Damien, just the stress on their face from how intense the workload was. And they were kids, and so you guys are adults, and so. But I want you to enjoy. I want you to look back and say, "Man, that was a fun week, and we got to talk about that stuff." And I want y'all to enjoy each other as well. I still have guys like Dave that I met in grad school. I wouldn't know Dave if it wasn't for free. And it was an online class, but we were in the same class and got to study together. And him being the nerd that he is, he went on and got his PhD after we got done. I have no interest in that at this stage of my life. Maybe when I'm 60, I will. I don't know. But so y'all enjoy it, hang out, enjoy your family, all those things. Y'all have anything else before we end this?
Sarah.
All right, so end recording.